When a warehouse worker saw a little girl staring hungrily at his daughter's fries in a roadside diner, he had no idea she was standing next to one of Chicago's most powerful CEOs, now secretly homeless and desperate. What happened next would expose corporate betrayal, hidden millions, and prove that sometimes the people with nothing left to lose are the ones who change everything. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey takes us. The fluorescent lights of Miller's roadside diner buzzed like dying wasps against the darkening Chicago sky. Mason Reed sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the rain-streaked window, watching his 8-year-old daughter Chloe drag a French fry through a puddle of ketchup with the kind of focused concentration that made his chest ache. She was humming something, probably that song from the cartoon she watched every morning before school, the one that made her laugh so hard she'd snort milk through her nose. Mason's work boots were still caked with dried mud from the warehouse loading dock. His shoulders felt like someone had been using them for batting practice. 16 pallets. 16 goddamn pallets of industrial tile, each one heavy enough to crush a man's foot if he wasn't careful. And he'd been careful for 11 hours straight, because being careful was the only thing standing between him and unemployment. And unemployment was the only thing standing between Chloe and the kind of life that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the water-stained ceiling of their apartment. "Daddy, you're doing it again." Mason blinked. "Doing what, baby?" "The thing where you look at stuff but you're not really looking." Chloe tilted her head, studying him with those dark eyes that were too knowing for 8 years old. Sarah's eyes. The resemblance hit him sometimes like a punch to the throat. Same long lashes, same way of narrowing them when she was trying to figure something out. "Sorry, just tired." He managed a smile and stole one of her fries. "How's your burger?" "Good." She took a massive bite that left ketchup on her nose. "But not as good as the ones Mama used to make." There it was. The knife that slipped between his ribs every single time, sharp and familiar. "No," Mason said quietly. "Nothing's as good as Mama's cooking." 3 years. 3 years since Sarah's car had hydroplaned on I-90 during a spring storm. 3 years since the state trooper had shown up at their door with that look on his face. 3 years since Mason had to explain to a 5-year-old why Mommy wasn't coming home. And people still said stupid things like time heals all wounds, as if grief was something that closed up neat and clean instead of just learning to walk around with a hole in your chest. The diner was mostly empty. A truck driver hunched over coffee at the counter, an elderly couple sharing pie in the corner booth. The waitress, Donna, according to her name tag, refilling salt shakers with the weary efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 20 years and would probably be doing it for 20 more. Mason checked his phone. 7:43. Chloe needed to be in bed by 9 on school nights, which meant they had maybe another 15 minutes before they'd have to brave the storm that was turning the parking lot into a shallow lake. The weather forecast had called for rain, but this was something meaner, the kind of March storm that felt personal, like Chicago itself was pissed off about something. "Can we get dessert?" Chloe asked, already knowing the answer but trying anyway. She was good at that, testing boundaries with just enough hope that it broke his heart to say no. "Not tonight, sweetheart. We've got those cookies at home, remember? The ones from the grocery store? The ones that taste like cardboard?" Mason laughed despite himself. "They're not that bad. They're worse than cardboard. I fed one to Mr. Whiskers, and he buried it in his litter box." "Chloe Reed, you did not feed our cat a cookie." "Okay, I didn't." She grinned, the lie transparent and completely unashamed. "But he would have buried it if I did." This was their routine, this back and forth that felt almost normal, almost like the life they used to have when Sarah was alive and money wasn't something Mason counted in his head 3 times a day. Breakfast, $2.30. Chloe's school lunch account, $15 a week. Rent, $850, due in 6 days. And he was still 100 short because the warehouse had cut overtime again, and the electricity bill had been higher than expected. He was doing the math in his head when the door chimed. Mason glanced up out of habit, the way you do in public places when you've got a kid to protect, and the world feels a little more dangerous than it used to. What he saw made him pause mid-reach for his water glass. A woman stood just inside the entrance, gripping the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. The woman was maybe 30, with dark hair plastered to her face and a wool coat that probably cost more than Mason made in a month. But the coat was soaked through, hanging heavy on her frame, and there was something about the way she stood, frozen, like she was trying to decide whether to stay or run, that didn't match the expensive clothes. The little girl beside her wore a pink jacket with a broken zipper and sneakers that squelched water onto the black and white checkered floor. Her face was pale, eyes huge and dark, and she was staring. Not at Mason. At Chloe's plate. At the fries. Mason felt something twist in his gut. He'd seen that look before. In the mirror, back when Sarah had first died and his grief had been so consuming that he'd forgotten to eat for days at a time. But this was different. This was a child, and the hunger in her eyes wasn't about forgetting to eat. It was about not having anything to eat. Daddy? Chloe had noticed too. She'd stopped mid-chew, following his gaze to the door. The woman noticed them staring and immediately looked away, her jaw tightening. She bent down to whisper something to the girl, then started steering her toward the restroom at the back of the diner. They passed close enough that Mason caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with rain and something else. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion. The woman's hands were shaking. Chloe watched them disappear around the corner. Then she looked at her father with an expression that was far too serious for someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. That girl looks hungry. I know, baby. Like really hungry. Like she hasn't eaten all day. Mason nodded slowly, his mind already working through logistics he couldn't afford. He had $23 in his wallet. The meal they'd just eaten had cost $14.60. That left $8.40 for gas tomorrow, for the milk Chloe would need for breakfast, for the 1,000 other small expenses that added up to survival. But that little girl's face, those eyes. How much are chicken tenders? He asked when Donna swung by to refill his coffee. The waitress raised an eyebrow. The kid's meal? $6.95. You want another one? Yeah, and another order of fries. Can you box it up? Sure thing, hun. Donna scribbled on her pad, but her eyes were shrewd. She'd been working diners long enough to recognize charity when she saw it. That for the lady and her little girl who just came in? If they want it. Donna's expression softened. You're a good man, Mason Reed. She'd learned his name 3 months ago when he'd started coming in after late shifts, and now she always greeted him like an old friend. Most people see someone down on their luck, and they look the other way. Yeah, well, Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Can't let a kid go hungry. While Donna headed to the kitchen, Chloe studied her father with an intensity that made him shift in his seat. What? He asked. Nothing, just thinking you're pretty okay for a dad. Pretty okay? That's the best I get? Top 5, maybe top 3 if you let me stay up an extra hour tonight. Nice try. The rain hammered against the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of darkness and streaking water. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, close enough to rattle the glass in its frame. Mason checked his phone again, 7:51, and wondered if they should just make a run for the car now before the storm got worse. But something kept him in his seat. Call it instinct, call it stupidity, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman and her daughter needed more than a to-go box of chicken tenders. They needed someone to see them. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Donna brought the boxed meal and set it on the table with a quiet smile, refusing to let Mason pay yet. Settle up when you're ready to leave, hun. And Chloe started building a fort out of sugar packets while humming that cartoon song again. Finally, the woman and her daughter emerged from the restroom. The woman had tried to dry her hair, but it was still damp and disheveled, falling around her face in a way that looked more exhausted than stylish. She'd wiped the rain from her daughter's cheeks, but the little girl's jacket was still dripping, and she was shivering. They headed for the exit. Mason didn't let himself think about it. He just stood up, grabbed the to-go box, and crossed the diner in 4 long strides. Excuse me. The woman turned, her eyes widening slightly. Up close, Mason could see she was beautiful in that sharp, expensive way. High cheekbones, clear skin, the kind of face you saw in magazines or on the news. But there were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were chapped. And when she looked at him, there was something defensive in her expression, like she was bracing for an attack. I'm sorry to bother you, Mason said, suddenly aware of how he must look. Mud on his boots, grease under his fingernails, the cheap cotton of his work shirt wrinkled and damp with sweat. But my daughter and I noticed your little girl, and we thought, well, We ordered too much food and it'd just go to waste. So if you wanted, we're fine. The woman's voice was clipped professional, the kind of voice used to giving orders and having them followed. Thank you, but we don't need. Her daughter's stomach growled. The sound was so loud in the quiet diner that it might as well have been a gunshot. The little girl's face flushed red. The woman's jaw clenched, and for a second Mason saw something crack in her expression. Humiliation, maybe? Or the kind of bone-deep shame that came from pride colliding with reality. Please, Mason said quietly. He held out the box. It's just chicken tenders and fries. No strings attached. My daughter insisted. The woman stared him the box like it was a live grenade. Her hands twitched at her sides. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't. Her voice caught. She cleared her throat. We can't accept charity from strangers. It's not charity. It's just dinner. We don't know you. My name's Mason Reed. I work at Patterson Shipping. I've got a daughter named Chloe who's 8 years old. I drive a 2003 Honda that barely runs, and I live in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side. Now you know me. The woman blinked. For the first time, something in her expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, that someone would be this direct, this honest with a complete stranger. Behind Mason, Chloe appeared at his elbow like a small, determined ghost. Hi, she said to the little girl. I'm Chloe. Do you like fries? Because these are really good. They're crispy. The little girl looked at her mother, then at Chloe, then at the to-go box. Her eyes were huge. Ava, the woman said softly, we should. I'm hungry, Mama. The words came out small and broken. I'm really, really hungry. The woman's face did something complicated. Mason watched her swallow hard, watched her close her eyes for just a second, watched her shoulders sag under the weight of some invisible burden he couldn't begin to understand. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. Okay, she whispered. Then, louder, okay. Thank you. Mason handed her the box. Their fingers brushed, and he felt how cold her hands were, how badly they were trembling. Would you like to sit down? The words were out before he could stop them. Just while you eat. The storm's pretty bad out there. The woman hesitated. Mason could see her weighing the offer, calculating risks, trying to decide if accepting would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Chloe solved the problem by grabbing the little girl's hand. Come on, she said brightly. You can sit with us. I've got sugar packets and we can make a castle. The little girl, Ava, looked at her mother again. The woman took a breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. They followed Chloe back to the booth like refugees following a guide through dangerous territory. Mason slid in across from them, watching as the woman helped Ava out of her wet jacket and draped it over the back of the booth. Ava immediately opened the to-go box, and the smell of hot food made her eyes widen even further. She looked at her mother one more time, silently asking permission. Go ahead, baby, the woman said softly. Ava ate like she hadn't seen food in days. She didn't even bother with the fork, just grabbed a chicken tender in both hands and bit into it with the kind of desperate focus that made Mason's heart crack down the middle. Chloe pushed her plate of leftover fries across the table without a word, and Ava took them too, cramming them into her mouth so fast she barely chewed. The woman watched her daughter eat, and Mason watched the woman. She was trying to maintain composure, trying to keep her face neutral, but he could see the cracks forming. The way her throat worked when she swallowed, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, the way she stared at nothing, like if she looked at her daughter for too long, she might shatter completely. Donna appeared with 2 glasses of water and set them down without comment. She met Mason's eyes, gave him a small nod, and disappeared again. For a while, nobody spoke. Ava ate. Chloe built sugar packet castles and narrated their construction in a low, serious voice. The rain hammered the windows. The diner's lights flickered once, twice, but held steady. Finally, Ava slowed down. She leaned back against the booth, one hand still clutching a fry, and let out a long, shaky breath. Color had returned to her cheeks. She looked at Chloe's sugar castle, then at Chloe. Can I help? She asked quietly. Chloe grinned. Yeah, you can be in charge of the towers. The woman watched the 2 girls start working together, and something in her expression finally broke. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but not before Mason saw it. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. You have no idea what this means. Mason wanted to say something comforting, something that would make this easier, but he'd never been good with words. Sarah had been the talker in their relationship, the one who knew exactly what to say when things got hard. Mason just fixed things. He fixed broken machines, broken schedules, broken days. He didn't know how to fix people. So he just said, "You're welcome." The woman took a breath. "I'm Victoria." She didn't offer a last name. Mason didn't ask. "Nice to meet you, Victoria." "And you?" She glanced at the girls, who were now deep in negotiation about whether the castle needed a moat. "Your daughter is very kind." "She gets it from her mother." The words came out automatically, the way they always did when someone complimented Chloe. "I mostly just try not to screw things up too badly." Victoria's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "That's a low bar." "Yeah, well, sometimes a low bar is all you can manage." They fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more like two people sitting in the same space and accepting that neither of them had to perform for the other. Mason sipped his coffee, which had gone lukewarm. Victoria stared at her water glass like it held answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. Outside, lightning flashed bright enough to turn the parking lot white. Thunder followed 3 seconds later, close enough to rattle the silverware. "That's getting worse," Mason observed. Victoria nodded. "We should go." She said it, but she didn't move. Ava and Chloe were giggling now, the sound bright and uncomplicated, and Mason saw Victoria's expression soften as she watched them. It was the look of someone who'd forgotten what joy sounded like, who was remembering it now with a mixture of relief and pain. "Where are you parked?" Mason asked. Victoria's jaw tightened. "The back lot." Something in the way she said it made Mason's instincts kick in. He glanced toward the window, toward the rain-soaked darkness beyond the diner's lights, and felt a prickle of unease. "What kind of car?" "A Range Rover." Her voice had gone flat again, defensive. "Why?" "Just wondering. Those are nice vehicles." It was. Victoria's hands curled into fists on the table. "Now it's just a piece of junk that barely starts and leaks when it rains and—" She stopped herself, closing her eyes. "Sorry. Long day." Mason studied her. The expensive coat. The way she held herself, spine straight even when she was clearly exhausted. The professional tone that slipped sometimes, revealing something raw underneath. This wasn't a woman who'd always struggled. This was someone who'd fallen, and fallen hard, and was still trying to figure out which way was up. "How long have you been living in it?" he asked quietly. Victoria's eyes snapped open. For a second, Mason thought she might deny it, might get angry, might grab Ava and walk out into the storm rather than admit the truth. Instead, she laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks and 3 days, if you want to be precise. We've been sleeping in the back seat because the heating doesn't work and it's warmer that way, all pressed together. Ava thinks we're camping. She keeps asking when we can go home, and I keep saying soon, soon, baby. Just a few more days, and I don't even know if that's true anymore, or if I'm just lying to make myself feel better. The words came out in a rush, like a dam breaking. Victoria pressed her hand to her mouth, clearly horrified that she'd said so much, but Mason just nodded. 2 weeks is a long time to camp, he said carefully. Yeah. Victoria's laugh was sharper this time. Especially when you used to run a company worth $40 million. Mason blinked. What? You heard me. Victoria met his eyes, and there was defiance there now, a kind of reckless honesty. Victoria Langford, CEO of Langford Technologies. Or at least I was. Before my CFO and 3 senior executives embezzled $8 million. Before my investors pulled funding. Before my ex-husband's lawyers tied up everything I owned in litigation. Before the media turned me into a cautionary tale about women who think they can play in the big leagues. She said it all in one breath, her voice rising slightly, and Mason realized this was probably the first time she'd said it out loud. The first time she'd admitted to another human being just how completely her life had imploded. Jesus, he said finally. Yeah. Victoria slumped back against the booth. Jesus pretty much sums it up. Across the table, the girls were oblivious, lost in their sugar castle world. Chloe was explaining the importance of structural integrity. Ava was nodding solemnly, arranging packets into careful rows. Mason didn't know what to say. He was a warehouse worker who'd barely graduated high school, who spent his days loading trucks and his nights trying to make sure his daughter had clean clothes for school. He knew nothing about corporate embezzlement or $40 million companies or the kind of pressure that came with running an empire. But he knew what it felt like to lose everything. He knew what it felt like to wake up one day and realize the life you'd built was gone, and you had to figure out how to survive in the wreckage. "I'm sorry," he said. Victoria shrugged. "Not your fault." Still sorry it happened. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Mason saw the moment she registered that he meant it. That this wasn't empty platitude, wasn't pity or condescension. Just one person acknowledging another person's pain. "Thank you," she said quietly. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside and the girls built their castle and Donna refilled coffee cups and pretended not to eavesdrop. Mason's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He couldn't just let this woman and her daughter go back out to that parking lot, back to a broken Range Rover that leaked in the rain. But what was he supposed to do? He barely had enough for himself and Chloe. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded like his father, always warning him about getting involved in other people's problems, told him to finish his coffee, pay his bill, and walk away. "You can't save everyone, Mason. You've got your own kid to worry about." But then he looked at Ava, at the way she was smiling for the first time since they'd arrived, at the ketchup on her chin and the light in her eyes, and he thought about Chloe sleeping safe in her bed tonight while another little girl shivered in a broken car. No, he couldn't do that. Sarah wouldn't have done that. "Look," Mason said before he could talk himself out of it, "I know we just met. I know you don't know me from Adam, but that storm's not letting up anytime soon, and if your car's as bad as you say it is, you're not going to make it far tonight." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "I've got a couch." The words felt insane coming out of his mouth. "It's not much. The apartment's small and the building's kind of a dump and the heater rattles like it's dying, but it's dry and it's warm, and Ava could sleep somewhere that's not a back seat." Victoria stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. "You're offering us your couch. Just for tonight, until the storm passes and you can figure out your next move. You don't even know us." "I know you're a mother trying to take care of her daughter. That's enough." Victoria's hand started shaking again. She gripped the edge of the table harder, her knuckles going white. "Why?" The word came out raw. "Why would you do that? What do you want?" Mason understood the question. In her world, nobody did anything without wanting something in return. Favors were currency. Kindness was a transaction. "I don't want anything," he said simply. "I just can't." He stopped, searching for words. 3 years ago, my wife died. Car accident. And for a while after that, I was drowning, couldn't think straight, couldn't take care of Chloe properly, could barely get out of bed some days. People helped us. Neighbors brought casseroles. Chloe's teacher gave her extra attention. The guy at the convenience store let me run a tab when money was tight. They didn't want anything. They just helped because that's what you do when someone's drowning. He met Victoria's eyes. "You're drowning," he said quietly. "So I'm helping." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mason wanted to look away, to give her privacy, but he also knew that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was witness someone's pain without flinching. After a minute, Victoria lowered her hands. Her face was blotchy and her mascara had run, but there was something different in her expression now. Something like hope. "Okay," she whispered. "Yeah? Yeah." She wiped her eyes. "Just for tonight, and then we'll be gone in the morning, I promise." Mason nodded. He pulled out his wallet and counted out the money for their meals plus a tip for Donna. $15.70. That left him with $7.30 for the rest of the week. He'd figure it out. He always did. "Girls," he called, "time to go." Chloe and Ava looked up from their castle, which had grown elaborate and slightly unstable. "Already?" Chloe protested. "Yeah, baby. Ava and her mom are going to come stay with us tonight." Chloe's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Really? Can we have a sleepover? Can Ava sleep in my room? Can we stay up late?" "We'll see." Mason stood, his back protesting after the long shift. "Come on, we're going to make a run for it." They gathered their things. Victoria helped Ava into her wet jacket, her hands gentle and practiced. Chloe bounced on her toes, already chattering about all the things she and Ava could do: board games, drawing, making popcorn if they had any left. At the door, Mason paused. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the parking lot had turned into a shallow lake. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Lightning flickered somewhere to the west. "On three," he said. "We run for my car. It's the gray Honda, third row back. Everyone ready?" The girls nodded. Victoria pulled her coat tighter. 1, 2, 3. They burst into the rain. It hit Mason like a cold slap, soaking through his shirt in seconds. He grabbed Chloe's hand and ran, his boots splashing through puddles. Behind him, he could hear Victoria and Ava following, their footsteps quick and stumbling. The Honda was right where he'd left it, looking sad and battered in the flickering parking lot lights. Mason fumbled with his keys, finally got the doors unlocked. Chloe scrambled into the back seat. Ava followed, and Victoria practically dove in after her daughter, pulling the door shut against the rain. Mason slid into the driver's seat, water streaming down his face. His hands were shaking, from cold or adrenaline, he wasn't sure. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. "No," Mason muttered. "Come on. Not now." He tried again. The engine turned over grudgingly, making a sound like a dying animal, but didn't catch. Behind him, he heard Ava's small voice. "Is the car broken?" "It's fine," Mason lied. "Just temperamental." He tried a third time, whispering a prayer to whatever deity looked after, broke single fathers with unreliable cars. The engine caught, held, settled into its usual rough idle. "Thank God," Victoria breathed. Mason threw the car into reverse and pulled out of the parking spot. The wipers could barely keep up with the rain, turning the world beyond the windshield into a smeared watercolor painting. He drove carefully, his hands tight on the wheel, trying to remember if he'd left the apartment in any kind of presentable state. Probably not. There were dishes in the sink, laundry on the couch, Chloe's toys scattered across the living room floor like landmines. "I should warn you," he said over his shoulder. "The place is kind of a mess." "Mason," Victoria's voice was soft. "We've been living in a car. I promise we won't judge your housekeeping." "Fair point." The drive took 15 minutes that felt like an hour. Mason's apartment building was on the south side, in a neighborhood that had seen better days but wasn't quite desperate yet. The kind of place where people kept their heads down and minded their own business, which suited Mason fine. He pulled into the building's small parking lot and killed the engine. "Third floor," he said. "Sorry, no elevator." They made another mad dash through the rain, this time to the building's entrance. Mason's hand shook so badly it took him 3 tries to get his key in the lock. Finally, the door swung open, and they tumbled into the narrow hallway that smelled like old carpet and somebody's cooking. The climb to the 3rd floor was quiet except for Chloe's chatter and the squeak of wet shoes on linoleum. Mason's apartment was at the end of the hall, 3F, the numbers hanging slightly crooked on the door. He unlocked it and pushed it open, and they stepped inside. It was exactly as bad as Mason had feared. Dishes in the sink, laundry on the couch, Chloe's art projects covering the coffee table. The place was tiny, a cramped living room that bled into an even smaller kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. The furniture was garage sale specials and hand-me-downs. The carpet had a stain near the window that Mason had never been able to get out, but it was warm, and it was dry. And when Chloe flipped on the lights, the whole place glowed with a kind of shabby comfort that made Mason's chest ache. Victoria stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the mat, and looked around. Mason braced himself for judgment, for the moment when she'd realize what a mistake she'd made accepting help from someone who lived like this. Instead, she started crying again. Not quiet tears this time. Full, body-shaking sobs that made Ava look up in alarm. "Mama?" Victoria dropped to her knees and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, burying her face in Ava's damp hair. "We're okay, baby," she choked out. "We're okay. We're safe." Mason looked at Chloe, who was watching with wide eyes. He put a hand on his daughter's shoulder and steered her toward the bedroom. "Why don't you find some dry clothes for Ava?" he suggested quietly. "Maybe those pajamas that got too small for you?" Chloe nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Mason grabbed a towel from the bathroom and brought it to Victoria, who was still kneeling on the floor, still holding Ava like she was afraid to let go. "Here," he said gently, draping the towel over her shoulders. Victoria looked up at him, her face wrecked, and whispered, "Thank you." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went to clear the laundry off the couch, thinking about how one decision, one moment of choosing to see instead of looking away, had brought a stranger into his home and would probably change everything in ways he couldn't begin to predict. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside in his small, shabby apartment, two little girls were laughing in the bedroom, trying on clothes. And a woman who'd lost everything was finally, breathing like she might survive this after all. Mason woke to the sound of whispers coming from the living room. For a disoriented moment, he thought it was Sarah, that he'd dreamed the last 3 years, that his wife was still alive and moving around their apartment in the early morning quiet. Then reality settled back into place like a stone in his chest, and he remembered. The diner, the storm, Victoria and Ava sleeping on his couch. He checked his phone. 5:43. The alarm wouldn't go off for another hour, but years of warehouse shifts had trained his body to wake before dawn, whether he wanted to or not. Through the thin wall, he could hear Chloe's steady breathing from her bed. She'd fallen asleep almost instantly last night, exhausted from excitement, her arm flung over Ava like they were old friends instead of kids who'd met 4 hours earlier. Mason pulled on a pair of sweatpants and padded barefoot into the living room. Victoria sat on the couch in the same clothes from yesterday, now dry but wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she was staring at her phone with an expression that made Mason's stomach clench. It was the look of someone reading their own obituary. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. Victoria's head snapped up. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" "No, I always get up early." Mason moved to the kitchen and started making coffee, mostly to give his hands something to do. "You want some?" "Please." The coffee maker was old and loud, filling the small apartment with grinding sounds and the smell of cheap grounds. Mason had bought the coffee on sale 3 weeks ago, something called Mountain Morning Blend that tasted like burnt cardboard. But Victoria accepted the mug he handed her like it was premium espresso. "Thank you." She wrapped both hands around the cup, holding it close to her chest. "For the coffee, for last night, for all of it." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable. "It's just a couch." "It's more than that." Victoria's voice was quiet but firm. "You have no idea what it meant to sleep somewhere that wasn't—" She stopped, her throat working. "Ava hasn't slept that well in weeks." Mason settled into the armchair across from her, cradling his own mug. The apartment was still dark except for the kitchen light spilling into the living room, creating shadows in the corners. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still that pre-dawn gray that made everything look washed out and sad. "So what now?" he asked. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Literally. You said your executives stole money. $8 million over 18 months. My CFO, Marcus Chen, was running a shell company, funneling payments for fake contracts, inflating vendor costs, skimming off government grants. He had help. 3 other executives who all thought they were clever enough to get away with it." Victoria's hands tightened on the mug. "They almost did. But you caught them. Eventually, after the damage was done. After investors started asking questions about our quarterly reports. After the board launched an internal audit." She took a sip of coffee and grimaced slightly at the taste but kept drinking. "I fired all 4 of them the same day. Filed criminal charges. Thought I was doing the right thing." "You were doing the right thing. Was I?" Victoria's eyes were sharp now, challenging. "Because doing the right thing cost me everything. The moment those charges became public, our stock tanked. Investors pulled out, partners terminated contracts. The media turned it into a feeding frenzy. Tech CEO loses control of her own company. Woman in over her head. The fall of Victoria Langford. Never mind that I'd built that company from nothing. Never mind that I'd grown revenue by 300% in 5 years. One scandal and suddenly I was the problem." Mason listened, recognizing the bitterness in her voice. He'd heard it before, in his own head, during those first terrible months after Sarah died when everything felt unfair and wrong and impossible to fix. "What about the courts?" he asked. "Can't you get the money back?" "Sure, eventually. Maybe. If the criminal trial goes our way, if we can untangle all the shell companies and offshore accounts. If the lawyers don't bleed us dry first." Victoria set down her mug with a sharp click. But trials take time, and time requires money, and money is the one thing I don't have. My ex-husband filed for full custody the minute the scandal broke, claiming I was too unstable to raise Ava. His lawyers tied up my personal assets in the divorce proceedings. The company's accounts are frozen pending the criminal investigation. I had some savings, but those ran out 2 weeks ago. So you've been living in your car. Living is a generous word. Surviving? Barely. Victoria pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I'd win the court case, get the company back, find investors willing to take a chance on rebuilding. But every door I knock on gets slammed in my face. Nobody wants to touch a CEO with this much baggage. The coffee maker beeped, signaling it had finished brewing. Mason got up to refill both their mugs, buying himself a moment to think. This was bigger than he'd realized, bigger than a woman down on her luck who needed a hot meal. This was systematic collapse, the kind that didn't get fixed with a couch and some chicken tenders. "What about family?" he asked, sitting back down. "Friends? Anyone who could help?" Victoria's laugh was sharper this time. "My parents died when I was 22. No siblings. And friends," she made air quotes around the word. "Turns out most of my friends were really business associates who liked being invited to exclusive parties. The minute I became a liability instead of an asset, they disappeared." "That's shitty. That's business." Victoria took another sip of coffee. "You learn pretty quickly who your real friends are when you stop being useful." They sat in silence for a moment. Through the window, Mason could see the sky starting to lighten, turning from charcoal to steel. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. A car started in the parking lot. "So what's your plan?" Mason asked. "You can't live in your car forever." "I know." Victoria's voice had gone flat again, emotionless. "I've been applying for jobs, marketing manager, operations director, anything that might use my skills. But I can't even get interviews. Everyone sees my resume and knows who I am. The CEO who lost control, the woman who couldn't manage her own company. Nobody wants that kind of PR problem." Mason thought about that. He thought about what it must be like to go from running a $40 million company to begging for entry-level positions, to have skills and experience that nobody wanted because your name had become toxic. "What if you didn't use your name, Po?" he suggested. Victoria blinked. "What?" "On your resume. What if you just, I don't know, used initials or something, changed enough details that people wouldn't immediately connect you to the scandal?" "That's lying. It's survival." Mason leaned forward, warming to the idea. "You're not lying about your skills or experience. You're just making it possible for people to see past the headlines and actually look at what you can do." Victoria stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "I've spent my entire career building my reputation. My name meant something. It opened doors. And now it closes them, so change the game." Mason shrugged. "I'm not saying it's fair, I'm just saying it might work." Victoria set down her mug and pressed her palms to her eyes. When she lowered them, she looked exhausted. "I don't even know anymore. I've been making decisions for so long, for the company, for employees, for investors, and every single one led me here. Maybe my judgment is shot. Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was." "You're smart enough to keep your daughter safe. That counts for something." "Does it?" Victoria's voice cracked. "I'm homeless, Mason. I'm 30 years old with an MBA from Stanford and 15 years of business experience, and I can't even provide my daughter with a bed to sleep in. What kind of mother does that make me?" "The kind who's doing her best in an impossible situation." "My best isn't good enough." Mason wanted to argue with her, to tell her she was being too hard on herself, but he also knew from experience that platitudes didn't help when you were drowning. So instead he just said, "Your daughter seems happy. She smiled last night. That's something." Victoria's expression softened slightly. "She did, didn't she? I haven't seen her smile like that in weeks." She paused. "Your daughter's wonderful, by the way. Chloe, she's got this energy that it's infectious. Ava hasn't had a real friend in months. All her classmates were from her old school, and when we couldn't pay tuition anymore," she stopped, shaking her head. "Sorry, you don't need to hear all this?" "I don't mind." "You should. Normal people don't invite homeless strangers into their apartments and then listen to them complain about corporate embezzlement over cheap coffee." Mason smiled despite himself. "Yeah, well, I've never been accused of being normal." Victoria almost smiled back. Almost. Then her phone buzzed on the couch cushion beside her, and whatever lightness had been building between them evaporated instantly. She grabbed the phone, looked at the screen, and her face went pale. "What is it?" Mason asked. "My lawyer." Victoria's hands were shaking again as she opened the message. Mason watched her eyes move across the screen, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her entire body go rigid. "Victoria?" "They moved the custody hearing." Her voice was barely a whisper. "My ex's lawyers petitioned to move it up. It's in 3 days." "Can they do that?" "Apparently." Victoria was scrolling frantically now, her breath coming faster. "There's an emergency clause. They're claiming I'm an unfit mother, that I've been... Oh, God." "What?" "They know." Victoria looked up at him, her eyes wide with panic. "They know about the car. They have photos. Someone's been following us, documenting where we've been sleeping, and now they're using it as evidence that I can't provide a stable home for Ava." Mason felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's legal? In a custody case? Everything's legal if you have expensive enough lawyers." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "They're going to take her. Mason, they're going to take my daughter, and there's nothing I can do about it. There has to be something." "What?" Victoria spun to face him. "What am I supposed to do? Show up to court and explain that, yes, I've been homeless for 2 weeks, but it's fine because a stranger let us sleep on his couch? That's not going to convince a judge I'm a fit parent. That's going to convince them I'm desperate and unstable." She wasn't wrong. Mason knew how the system worked. He'd seen it after Sarah died when well-meaning social workers had shown up to check on Chloe to make sure Mason was capable of single parenthood. They'd been nice about it, professional, but the message was clear. Prove you can do this, or we'll find someone who can. "What about the company?" he asked. "If you could show the court that you're getting it back, that you've got income again." "The company's dead, Mason. Even if I win the criminal case, even if I get the money back, I'd still have to rebuild from scratch, find investors, rehire staff, regain client trust. That takes years, not days." "So do something else, something faster." Victoria laughed, high and sharp. "Like what? Get a job at McDonald's? I'm sure that'll really impress the judge." "Yes, Your Honor, I may be living in a car and flipping burgers, but I'm totally capable of raising a child." "That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean?" Victoria's voice rose, and Mason remembered there were kids sleeping in the next room. She must have remembered too, because she lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. "Tell me, Mason, what's your brilliant solution? Because I've spent every waking hour of the last 2 weeks trying to figure this out, and I've got nothing. Nothing except a court date in 3 days and the absolute certainty that I'm about to lose the only thing in this world that matters to me." The words hung in the air between them. Victoria's chest was heaving, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Mason had the distinct impression she wanted to hit something, or scream, or both. Instead, she collapsed back onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice muffled. "I shouldn't yell at you. You've been nothing but kind, and here I am taking it out on you like this is somehow your fault. It's okay. It's not okay. Nothing about this is okay." Victoria lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, like she'd cried so much over the past weeks that she didn't have any tears left. "I used to be someone who solved problems. That was my whole identity. CEO, problem solver. The woman who could walk into a room and figure out the most efficient path from A to B, and now I can't even solve my own life." Mason didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been a CEO, never run a company, never had that kind of pressure. But he knew what it felt like to have your identity stripped away. He'd been a husband once, Sarah's husband. That had been part of who he was, how he defined himself. And then Sarah died. And suddenly he was just a single father trying to keep his head above water. "Maybe the problem is you're trying to solve everything at once," he said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke. "Like, you're looking at this huge mess, the company, the money, the custody case, the job search, and trying to fix all of it simultaneously. But what if you just focused on one thing, the custody hearing? What would it take to win that?" Victoria considered this. Stability, a permanent address, proof of income, evidence that I can provide a safe home for Ava. "Okay, so how do you get those things in 3 days?" I don't. That's the problem. Maybe you do. Mason was thinking out loud now, following a thread he couldn't quite see yet. The address part, you could use mine. Victoria's head snapped up. What? For the court. You could say you're staying here. It's not a lie if you actually are staying here. Mason, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. He held up a hand before she could protest. Just until the custody hearing. After that, we figure out next steps, but right now you need an address that isn't a car. I've got one. Use it. Victoria stared at him. You don't even know me. I know enough. You really don't. I could be a terrible person. I could be lying about everything. Are you? No, but then what's the problem? Victoria opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The problem is I don't understand why you're doing this. People don't just help strangers for no reason. Sure they do. You've just been around the wrong people. Clearly. Victoria's voice was softer now, less defensive. But Mason, even if I use your address, I still need proof of income. The court's going to ask how I'm supporting myself. An unemployed CEO living on a friend's couch isn't going to cut it. Mason thought about this. He thought about the conversation they'd just had, about Victoria's skills and experience, about all that knowledge going to waste because nobody would look past the scandal. Then he thought about something else, something that had been nagging at him for months. Can you do bookkeeping? He asked. Victoria blinked at the non sequitur. What? Bookkeeping, like accounting, managing finances, that kind of thing. I have an MBA in finance. I built financial models for a $40 million company. So yes, I can do bookkeeping. What about operations management, supply chain stuff? That was literally my job for 15 years. Why are you asking? Mason leaned back in his chair, the idea taking shape. Patterson Shipping, the warehouse where I work, it's a mess. Has been for years. The owner, Dave Patterson, is a good guy, but he's terrible with numbers. Always behind on invoices, losing track of inventory, scheduling trucks wrong. He knows it's a problem, complains about it all the time, but he can't afford to hire someone full-time to fix it. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting I work at a warehouse. I'm suggesting you help fix their operations. Dave's been talking about bringing someone in part-time, someone who could organize the chaos. He just hasn't found anyone yet. Mason, I ran a tech company. I managed teams of engineers and developers. I don't know anything about warehouses. But you know about logistics, right? About making systems more efficient? That's what Dave needs. Someone who can look at his disaster of a filing system and actually make sense of it. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Mason could see her mind working, see her running through possibilities and problems. Even if he hired me, she said finally, it wouldn't pay much. Part-time warehouse consulting isn't exactly a high-salary position. But it's proof of income. It's something you could tell the court. It's also completely outside my field. The judge is going to wonder why a tech CEO is suddenly working at a shipping warehouse. So you don't tell them you're a tech CEO. You tell them you're a business consultant helping small companies improve their operations. Which would be true. Victoria rubbed her temples. This is insane. Yeah, probably. I don't even know if your boss would hire me. Only one way to find out. Mason checked the time. 6:15. Dave gets in around 7. I could call him, feel him out. If he's interested, you could meet with him today. Today? You've got 3 days until the custody hearing. We don't exactly have time to waste. Victoria looked at him like he was crazy. Maybe he was. Maybe this whole thing was a terrible idea that would blow up in both their faces. But Mason had learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way through a problem was straight ahead. Consequences be damned. Okay, Victoria said quietly. Okay. Call him. Mason pulled out his phone and scrolled to Dave's number. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. This better be important, Reed. I haven't even had my coffee yet. Morning, Dave. Sorry to call so early. You sick? You sound weird. I'm fine. Just wanted to talk to you about something. You remember how you've been complaining about the office being disorganized? Complaining? I've been begging for help. Why, you finally going to learn how to file properly? Not me, but I know someone who might be able to help. She's got experience with operations management, logistics, that kind of thing. Looking for part-time work. There was a pause. Mason could hear Dave slurping coffee on the other end of the line. She expensive? Dave asked finally. I think she'd be willing to negotiate. She needs work pretty quickly. What's the catch? No catch. She's good at what she does. She needs a job. You need help. Seemed like a fit. Another pause. This someone you're vouching for? Mason glanced at Victoria, who was watching him with an expression caught between hope and terror. Yeah, he said. I'm vouching for her. All right, tell her to come by the office around 8. I'll give her 15 minutes. If she can make sense of my filing system in that time, maybe we can work something out. Thanks, Dave. Don't thank me yet. If she's as useless as the last 3 people I interviewed, you're going to owe me for wasting my time. The line went dead. Mason set down his phone and looked at Victoria. You've got a meeting at 8. Victoria's hands had started shaking again. I don't have a resume. I don't have professional clothes that aren't soaked through. I don't have... We'll figure it out. Mason stood. I've got a laptop. You can write up something quick. And there's a thrift store 2 blocks from the warehouse. Opens at 7:30. We can grab you something that looks professional enough. Mason, 3 days, Victoria. You said it yourself. We don't have time to waste. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, something hardening in her expression. The panic was still there, but underneath it, Mason could see something else emerging. Determination, maybe. Or just desperation backed into a corner. Okay, she said. Okay. Let's do this. The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Mason showed Victoria how to use his ancient laptop while he took a shower. By the time he emerged, she'd pulled together a 1-page resume that highlighted her operations experience without mentioning Langford Technologies by name. It was vague enough to avoid immediate recognition, but specific enough to show she knew what she was doing. At 7, Chloe stumbled out of the bedroom, Ava trailing behind her. Both girls had bedhead and sleepy eyes.
Why's everybody up so early?
Chloe yawned. Victoria's got a job interview, Mason explained. I need to run her over to the thrift store real quick. You girls okay here for 20 minutes? Chloe perked up immediately. Can we make pancakes? No cooking without a grown-up. Can we eat cereal? Sure. Just don't make a mess. They left the girls arguing cheerfully about whether Frosted Flakes or Cheerios were better and headed down to Mason's car. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of post-storm clarity that made everything look sharp-edged and surreal. The thrift store was exactly what Mason expected. Racks of donated clothes smelling faintly of mothballs, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, a bored teenager behind the register. Victoria moved through the aisles quickly, efficiently, pulling items with the same focus she'd probably used to run board meetings. She emerged from the dressing room 15 minutes later wearing gray slacks and a black blazer that fit well enough. Not perfect, but professional. The kind of outfit that said, I'm serious about this job, without screaming, I used to run a company worth millions. How do I look? She asked. Mason considered her. The clothes were fine, but it was her expression that had changed. The defeated exhaustion from earlier was gone, replaced by something sharper. She looked like someone preparing for battle. You look like someone Dave would hire, he said. They made it back to the apartment with 10 minutes to spare. Victoria used the bathroom to fix her hair and put on minimal makeup from a compact she'd pulled from her purse. When she emerged, she looked almost like the CEO she used to be, poised, professional, ready to solve problems. Almost. If you looked close enough, you could still see the cracks, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she picked up the resume, the fear lurking behind the professional mask. You've got this, Mason said. Victoria took a breath. Right. I've got this. She didn't sound convinced. The drive to Patterson Shipping took 12 minutes. The warehouse was a squat concrete building near the industrial district, surrounded by chain-link fence and semi-trucks in various states of loading. Mason pulled into the small parking lot and killed the engine. Dave's office is through the main entrance, up the stairs, second door on the left, he said. He's gruff, but fair. And if he gives you a hard time about anything, just remember you've negotiated with investors who are actually trying to destroy you. This is nothing. Victoria's laugh was shaky. Right, nothing. She got out of the car, shoulders squared, and walked toward the building like she was heading into enemy territory. Mason watched her go, wondering if he'd just helped her or made everything worse. His phone buzzed, a text from Chloe. Ava wants to know if her mom is coming back. Mason typed quickly. Yes, just at a meeting. Be back soon. He hoped that was true. Inside the warehouse, Dave Patterson sat behind a desk buried under paperwork and empty coffee cups. He was 50-something with a beer gut and permanent grease stains on his shirt, and he ran his shipping business the way Mason's dad had run his auto shop, by feel and instinct rather than organization or planning. It had worked well enough for 20 years, but now things were getting complicated. More clients, more shipments, more regulations, and Dave was drowning in details he'd never bothered to track before. When Victoria knocked on his door, Dave looked up with the expression of a man who'd already decided this was going to be a waste of time. "You the operations person Reed called about?" "Yes, sir." Victoria extended her hand. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." Dave shook her hand briefly, then waved at the disaster of his office. "This is what I'm dealing with. Invoices from 3 months ago that never got filed. Shipping manifests that don't match inventory records. A scheduling system that exists entirely in my head, which means when I'm not here, nobody knows what the hell they're supposed to be doing." Victoria surveyed the chaos with the calm assessment of someone who'd seen worse. "How many trucks do you run?"
8. Usually, sometimes 10 if we're busy.
"How many employees?"
23, counting drivers and warehouse staff. Annual revenue? Dave narrowed his eyes. "Why do you need to know that?" "Because I need to understand the scope of the problem before I can propose a solution." Dave studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "About 3 million, give or take." Victoria nodded, her mind clearly working through numbers. "And you said this is part-time work?"
20 hours a week, max. I can't afford full-time." "What's your budget for the position?" 18 an hour. That's already stretching it." Mason, leaning against the doorframe where Dave couldn't see him, but Victoria could, winced. 18 an hour for someone with Victoria's experience was insulting. He waited for her to walk out. Instead, Victoria said, 22, and I'll have your filing system organized within 2 weeks. Dave's eyebrows rose. "Pretty confident. I know what I'm doing." "Yeah, where'd you work before?" "Various consulting positions, operations management, logistics coordination, financial systems." Victoria's voice was steady, professional. The lies, or carefully edited truths, came easily. "I can provide references if needed." "References don't mean much to me." Dave picked up a random stack of papers from his desk. "Tell me what's wrong with this." He handed her what appeared to be an invoice. Victoria scanned it for maybe 10 seconds. "Your vendor code doesn't match your internal tracking system," she said. "You've got them listed as Patterson-Vive-047, but your inventory records probably have them under something completely different, which means when you're trying to reconcile expenses against shipments, you're doing it manually instead of letting the systems talk to each other. That's why you're always behind." Dave's expression shifted. "How'd you know that?" "Because it's the most common mistake in businesses this size. You started with one system, added another as you grew, never bothered to integrate them properly. Now you're stuck maintaining 2 separate databases that should be one. Can you fix it?" "Yes, but it'll take longer than 2 weeks. Maybe a month if your records are as messy as they look." Dave sat back in his chair, reassessing. Mason could see the moment the calculation shifted in his boss's head. This wasn't some desperate job seeker who'd say anything to get hired. This was someone who actually knew what she was talking about. 20 an hour, Dave said. "And if you can really fix this mess in a month, I'll consider bumping you to 25 after that." Victoria hesitated. Mason could see her running the math. 20 hours a week at $20 was $400 a week, $1,600 a month. Not enough to live on, barely enough to matter. But it was something. Proof of income. A legitimate job she could reference in court. "Deal," she said, and shook Dave's hand. Mason let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Victoria started work the next morning at 6:30, which meant she was at Patterson Shipping before Mason's shift even began. He found her in Dave's office, now her office too, apparently, surrounded by banker's boxes full of unfiled invoices, a laptop borrowed from Dave's nephew, and 3 empty coffee cups that suggested she'd been there for hours. "You're early," Mason said from the doorway. Victoria didn't look up from the spreadsheet she was building. "I'm behind. There's a difference." "Behind on what? You just started yesterday." "Behind on everything." She finally glanced at him, and Mason saw the dark circles under her eyes had gotten worse, not better. The custody hearing is in 2 days. 2 days, Mason. I need to have everything ready. Proof of employment, proof of residence, character references, evidence that I can provide stability for Ava. I don't have time to be early or late. I just have time to work. Mason understood that kind of desperation. He'd lived it after Sarah died, when grief had felt like a luxury he couldn't afford because there were bills to pay and a daughter to feed and no time to fall apart. You sleep at all last night? He asked. Some. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. Victoria turned back to her screen, fingers flying across the keyboard. I've mapped out Dave's entire vendor database. Turns out he's been paying the same company under 3 different names because they kept changing their invoicing system, and he never noticed. I've already saved him about $1,500 in duplicate payments. In 1 day? In 4 hours. This place is a gold mine of inefficiency. I could probably cut his operating costs by 20% in the first month alone. Mason leaned against the doorframe watching her work. This was a different Victoria from the broken woman who'd stood in the diner 2 nights ago. This version was focused, sharp, almost manic in her intensity. He recognized it as a coping mechanism, the same way he'd thrown himself into double shifts after Sarah died, working until his body gave out so he wouldn't have to think about the hole in his life. You should eat something, he said. I'm fine. Victoria, I said I'm fine. Her voice was sharp enough to cut. Then she stopped, closed her eyes, and took a breath. Sorry. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help. I can't stop moving. If I stop moving, I'll start thinking. And if I start thinking, I'll remember that in 2 days, a judge is going to decide whether I'm fit to be Ava's mother, and the answer might be no. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the desk to still them. Mason crossed the office and set a granola bar on top of her keyboard. Eat, then keep working. But eat first. Victoria stared at the granola bar like it was a puzzle she needed to solve. Then she picked it up, unwrapped it, and took a mechanical bite. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome. Mason checked his phone. 6:45. I've got to clock in. You need anything? An extra 10 hours in the day would be nice. Fresh out of those? How about more coffee instead? The ghost of a smile crossed Victoria's face. That works too. Mason spent his shift loading pallets and thinking about custody hearings. He didn't know much about family court, but he knew enough to understand that appearances mattered. A judge wasn't going to care about Victoria's MBA or her ability to optimize vendor databases. They were going to care about whether she could provide a stable home for a 7-year-old girl. During his lunch break, he called his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd been bringing Chloe homemade dumplings and watching her after school since Sarah died. She agreed without hesitation to write a character reference for Victoria. Any friend of yours is good people, Mason, she said firmly. I'll have it ready by tomorrow. He also called Donna from the diner, who remembered Victoria and Ava, and agreed to write a short statement about how they'd seemed that night. It wasn't much, but it was something. Another piece of evidence that Victoria was a caring mother doing her best. When Mason's shift ended at 3, he found Victoria still in the office, now reorganizing Dave's filing cabinets with the same intensity most people reserve for defusing bombs. You've been here 9 hours, Mason said. 9.5. Dave said I could stay as long as I wanted. Victoria, you're going to burn out. I'll burn out after the hearing. She filed another invoice with sharp precision. Right now, I need to finish this vendor reconciliation and then work on the summary document my lawyer requested. Then I need to prep for court, make sure Ava has something appropriate to wear, and figure out how to explain to a judge why living in a car for 2 weeks doesn't make me a terrible mother. Her voice cracked on the last word. Mason watched her grip the filing cabinet hard enough that her knuckles went white. Hey, he said gently. You're not a terrible mother. Tell that to the court. I will if I have to. Victoria turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her face. What? If they'll let me testify or whatever, I'll tell them. You're a good mother. I've seen you with Ava. The way you make sure she eats before you do, the way you check on her in the middle of the night, the way you're working yourself into the ground to give her a stable home. That's not a terrible mother. That's someone who gives a damn. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back furiously, but one escaped anyway, trailing down her cheek. I don't know how to win this, she whispered. I don't know how to walk into that courtroom and convince a judge that I'm not a disaster. Because the truth is, Mason, I am a disaster. I lost my company. I lost my home. I've been living in a car with my daughter and lying to her about why we can't go back to our old life. What kind of person does that? The kind who's surviving something impossible. That's not good enough for a custody hearing. Mason didn't have an answer for that. Because she was right. Surviving wasn't the same as thriving, and family courts wanted to see evidence of thriving, stable income, permanent housing, a safe environment. Victoria had barely cobbled together the minimum, and even that felt fragile. "What does your lawyer say?" he asked. Victoria laughed bitterly. "My lawyer says we have a 30% chance of winning, maybe 40 if everything goes perfectly and my ex's lawyers don't bring up the embezzlement scandal, which they will because of course they will. It's their best weapon." "Can they do that? I thought the criminal charges cleared you." "They did. I'm not under investigation. But that doesn't matter. The scandal still happened. The company still collapsed. And in family court, perception is everything. My ex is going to paint me as reckless and unstable. His lawyers are going to suggest that Ava deserves better than a mother who can't even keep a roof over her head. And the worst part is," her voice broke, "the worst part is maybe they're right. They're not right." "How do you know?" "Because I've met your ex." Victoria blinked. "No, you haven't. Not personally. But I've met guys like him. Guys who wait until you're down to kick you harder. Guys who use kids as weapons in their own battles." Mason thought about Sarah's brother, who'd tried to get custody of Chloe after the accident, claiming Mason was too grief-stricken to parent properly. The court had ruled in Mason's favor, but it had been close. Too close. "Your ex doesn't care about Ava's best interests. He cares about winning. There's a difference." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "How did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just experienced in things sucking." That surprised a real laugh out of her, short and startled, but genuine. The sound seemed to surprise Victoria herself, like she'd forgotten what laughing felt like. "Come on," Mason said, making a decision. "Pack up your stuff. We're leaving." "I can't. I still have—" "Victoria, it's 3:15. Ava gets out of school in 45 minutes. Chloe too. We need to pick them up and then we're all going to go home and have dinner like normal people instead of disasters who work themselves to death." "I'm not hungry." "You're never hungry. Eat anyway." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She saved her work, shut down the laptop, and grabbed her borrowed blazer from the back of the chair. They picked up both girls from Chloe's elementary school, where Ava had been enrolled as a temporary student using Mason's address. The principal had asked questions, lots of questions, but Mason had explained that Victoria was a family friend going through a difficult time, and the principal had decided not to push. Small mercies. Chloe and Ava burst out of the school building holding hands and talking over each other about something that had happened at recess. Mason felt something in his chest loosen at the sight. Ava looked like a normal kid again, hair in pigtails, backpack bouncing, smile bright. Not like a child who'd been sleeping in a car 2 days ago. "Mama?" Ava ran to Victoria and threw her arms around her mother's waist. "I got a gold star on my math worksheet." Victoria knelt down to Ava's level, and Mason saw her force a smile onto her face, pushing aside the exhaustion and fear. "That's wonderful, baby. I'm so proud of you." "And Mrs. Patterson said I could be line leader tomorrow." "Mrs. Patterson knows talent when she sees it." Chloe appeared at Mason's elbow. "Can Ava come over again tonight?" "Ava lives with us now, remember?" Mason said. "At least for a little while." "Oh, right," Chloe grinned. "This is the best week ever." Mason wished he could share her optimism. Dinner was spaghetti from a box and sauce from a jar, prepared in Mason's tiny kitchen, while the girls did homework at the coffee table. Victoria tried to help, but she moved through the apartment like a ghost, distracted and distant. Twice Mason caught her staring at nothing, her expression blank. "You okay?" he asked while draining pasta. "Fine, just thinking." "About the hearing?" "About everything." Victoria leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "About how a week ago I was sleeping in a car, and now I'm in a stranger's apartment making spaghetti. About how none of this feels real. About how I keep waiting for it all to fall apart." "It's not going to fall apart. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise spaghetti, which is something." Victoria's lips twitched. "Your optimism is disturbing." "I prefer to think of it as delusional hope." "Sounds better." They ate dinner together, All four of them crowded around the coffee table because Mason's apartment didn't have a dining table. Ava told a long, complicated story about a girl in her class who'd brought a pet frog for show and tell. Chloe argued that frogs were gross and hamsters were better. Mason refereed the debate while Victoria picked at her food, eating maybe 3 bites total. After dinner, the girls wanted to watch a movie. Mason set them up with something animated on the TV while he and Victoria cleaned up in the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, Victoria washing dishes while Mason dried, and for a moment it almost felt domestic, like they were a family instead of two strangers thrown together by circumstance. "I talked to my lawyer today," Victoria said quietly, scrubbing a plate, "about the custody arrangement." Mason's hand stilled on the dish towel. "And she thinks using your address will help. The job too. She's going to present it as evidence of stability, that I secured employment and housing within days of the crisis, that I'm taking active steps to rebuild." Victoria set the plate in the rinse rack. "But she also warned me that my ex's lawyers are going to attack it. They're going to say it's fake, that I'm manipulating the situation, that I'm using you to create an illusion of stability that doesn't really exist. That's bullshit." "That's also effective, because they're not entirely wrong, are they? This arrangement, it's temporary. You've been clear about that. After the hearing, I'll need to find somewhere else to go, which means I'm not really stable. I'm just pretending to be." Mason dried the plate slowly, thinking, "What if you didn't have to leave?" Victoria turned to look at him. "What? After the hearing, what if you stayed, you and Ava, just until you get back on your feet properly?" "Mason, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." "Why?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "Why do you keep helping me? You don't owe me anything. We're strangers. You should want me gone, not offering to extend this bizarre arrangement." Mason set down the plate and the towel. He'd been asking himself the same question for 2 days, trying to understand why he was doing this, why he'd invited Victoria into his home, why he'd helped her get a job, why he was standing in his kitchen offering to let her stay indefinitely. "After Sarah died," he said slowly, "people kept telling me I needed to move on, get back to normal. But there was no normal anymore. Normal had died with my wife. And for a long time I was just stuck, going through the motions but not really living, just surviving." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Then one day, maybe 6 months after the accident, I was at the grocery store with Chloe, and she asked if we could buy cookies, these expensive ones Sarah used to get for special occasions. And I almost said no, because money was tight and we didn't need expensive cookies. But then I thought, what's the point of surviving if we're just going to be miserable? So I bought the cookies. And when we got home, Chloe and I ate half the package while watching cartoons. And for the first time in months, I felt like maybe we were going to be okay." Victoria was watching him intently now. "Helping you feels like buying those cookies," Mason said. "Like maybe there's more to life than just getting through the day. Like maybe doing something good for someone else is the same as doing something good for myself. Does that make sense?" "No," Victoria said, then softer. "But I understand it anyway." They stood in the kitchen, the sound of the movie drifting in from the living room, and Mason felt something shift between them. Not romance, it wasn't that, but something deeper, the recognition of two people who'd both lost everything and were trying to figure out how to build something from the wreckage. "I'll stay," Victoria said finally, "until I can afford my own place. But I'm paying rent." "You don't have to—" "I'm paying rent," she repeated firmly. "Even if it's just $100 a month. I need to contribute something, for my own sanity if nothing else." Mason nodded. "Okay, deal." They shook on it and Victoria's hand was warm in his. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp woman named Ellen Bradshaw, who worked out of a tiny office in downtown Chicago, came by the apartment to review everything. She interviewed Mason, took notes on the living situation, photographed the apartment to show it was clean and safe. "This is good," Ellen said, clicking through photos on her phone. "Much better than I expected. The judge will see that Ms. Langford has secured stable housing and employment. That's half the battle." "What's the other half?" Victoria asked. She was sitting on the couch, spine rigid, hands folded in her lap, convincing them that the homelessness was temporary and circumstantial, not a pattern of instability. Ellen set down her phone. "Your ex's lawyers are going to argue that you've demonstrated poor judgment, both in your business decisions and your personal life. They're going to paint the embezzlement scandal as evidence that you can't manage your own affairs, let alone raise a child. I was the victim of the embezzlement, Victoria said tightly. I didn't steal anything. I know, but perception matters more than facts in family court. We need to show the judge that you're moving forward, not dwelling on the past. The job helps. The housing helps. Character references help. Ellen glanced at Mason. Mr. Reed's testimony will be particularly valuable. A neutral third party vouching for your parenting skills carries weight. Mason shifted uncomfortably. I'm not neutral. I'm her... He stopped, unsure what to call himself. Friend felt too simple. Landlord felt too transactional. You're her support system, Ellen finished, which is exactly what the judge needs to see, that Ms. Langford isn't alone, that she has people in her corner. After Ellen left, Victoria retreated to the bedroom she now shared with Ava. Mason could hear her moving around, rehearsing answers to potential questions, her voice a low murmur through the thin walls. She was still preparing at midnight when Mason went to bed, and she was already awake when he got up at 5:30 the next morning. The custody hearing was at 10. They dressed carefully, Victoria in her thrift store blazer and slacks, hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mason in the one button-down shirt he owned that didn't have grease stains. Ava wore a blue dress that Chloe had outgrown, her hair in careful braids that Victoria had spent 20 minutes perfecting. Chloe stayed home with Mrs. Chen, disappointed but understanding. The courthouse was downtown, all marble floors and harsh fluorescent lights. Mason had been inside once before, for a traffic ticket, and he'd hated it then too. The place felt designed to make you feel small and wrong. Victoria's ex-husband was already there when they arrived. Richard Langford was exactly what Mason expected. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood with two lawyers who looked like they ate nails for breakfast, and when he saw Victoria, his expression shifted to something Mason could only describe as smug. "Victoria," Richard said smoothly, you look like you've had a difficult few weeks." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Richard, and this must be your, boyfriend, new husband?" Richard's eyes flicked to Mason with barely concealed contempt. "How modern of you." "Mason is a friend who's helping me through a difficult time," Victoria said, "something you never managed to do. I'm trying to help now. I'm trying to give our daughter a stable home. By taking her away from her mother? By protecting her from your poor decisions." Ellen appeared at Victoria's elbow. "Mr. Langford, let's save the drama for the courtroom, shall we?" Richard's smile widened. "Of course. See you inside, Victoria." He walked away with his lawyers, leaving Victoria trembling with suppressed rage. "Breathe," Ellen said quietly. "Don't let him get to you. That's what he wants." Victoria nodded, but Mason could see how rattled she was. This was different from the boardroom battles she was used to. This was personal. This was her daughter. The courtroom was smaller than Mason expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces he'd seen on TV. Judge Patricia Holloway presided from behind a wooden desk, looking stern and no-nonsense in her black robes. She was maybe 60, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. The hearing began with opening statements. Richard's lead attorney, a man named Carter Mills, painted a picture of Victoria as reckless and unstable. He detailed the embezzlement scandal, the company's collapse, the 2 weeks Victoria had spent living in her car with Ava. "This is a woman who has demonstrated repeatedly that she cannot manage her own life," Mills said. "She trusted the wrong people with her business. She made financial decisions that left her homeless. She subjected a 7-year-old child to sleeping in a vehicle. These are not the actions of a fit parent. These are the actions of someone who needs help before she can provide adequate care for a child." Mason felt Victoria go rigid beside him. Ellen stood for her rebuttal. "Your Honor, Ms. Langford was the victim of a sophisticated embezzlement scheme perpetrated by trusted employees. She took immediate action when she discovered the fraud, firing the responsible parties and cooperating fully with law enforcement. The temporary housing crisis was a direct result of her ex-husband's decision to freeze her assets during divorce proceedings while she was fighting to save her company. Despite these extraordinary circumstances, Ms. Langford secured employment and stable housing within 48 hours. She has demonstrated resilience, resourcefulness, and an unwavering commitment to her daughter's well-being. The judge listened without expression, taking notes. Then came the witnesses. Richard testified first, describing Victoria as a workaholic who'd always prioritized her career over family. He painted himself as the concerned father who'd watched his daughter become collateral damage in Victoria's business ambitions. Mason wanted to punch him. When it was Victoria's turn, she walked to the witness stand with her shoulders back, looking more like a CEO than a woman fighting to keep her daughter. She answered questions calmly, explaining the embezzlement, the collapse, the desperate weeks in the car. She didn't make excuses. She didn't cry. She just told the truth. "I made mistakes," she said when Mills tried to trap her in contradictions. "I trusted the wrong people. I should have caught the embezzlement sooner, but none of those mistakes change the fact that I love my daughter and have always put her needs first. Yes, we slept in a car for 2 weeks. It was awful, but I kept her safe. I kept her fed. I kept her in school. And the moment I had an opportunity to improve our situation, I took it. That's not poor judgment. That's survival." Mills smirked. "Survival in the form of moving in with a man you'd known for less than 24 hours? A warehouse worker with barely enough income to support his own child, let alone yours." "Mason Reed offered help when no one else would," Victoria said, her voice steel. "He saw a child who was hungry, and he fed her. He saw a mother who was drowning, and he threw her a lifeline. That's not poor judgment on my part. That's being smart enough to accept kindness when it's offered." The judge's pen scratched across her notepad. Then it was Mason's turn. He'd never testified in court before, and his hands were sweating as he took the stand. Ellen asked him basic questions: how he'd met Victoria, what he'd observed about her parenting, why he'd offered to help. Mason answered honestly. He talked about the hunger in Ava's eyes that first night, the way Victoria had refused charity until her daughter's needs overrode her pride. The countless times he'd watched Victoria put Ava first, making sure she ate before Victoria did, checking on her in the night, working herself to exhaustion to build a better life. "She's a good mother," Mason said firmly. "One of the best I've seen, and I've seen a lot of parents since my daughter started school. Victoria makes mistakes like everyone else, but she loves that little girl with everything she has. That's got to count for something." Mills cross-examined him, trying to suggest that Mason barely knew Victoria, that his testimony was biased, that he had financial incentive to keep Victoria in his apartment collecting rent. Mason met his eyes steadily. "I'm not getting rich off Victoria's rent. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Maybe that's hard for you to understand, but it's the truth." The judge's expression flickered. Was that approval? But she said nothing. The hearing lasted 3 hours. By the end, Mason felt wrung out and exhausted. He couldn't imagine how Victoria felt. Judge Holloway announced she would deliberate and deliver her decision in 1 week. 1 week of waiting to learn if Victoria would keep her daughter. They left the courthouse in silence, the winter sun weak and gray overhead. Victoria's hands were shaking again. She'd held it together through the entire hearing, but now that it was over, the adrenaline was draining away and leaving her hollow. "You did good in there," Mason said quietly. Victoria shook her head. "I don't know. Mills was effective. The stuff about the car, the judge kept writing notes every time he mentioned it. Ellen was effective too. Maybe," Victoria's voice was small, "or maybe I just destroyed my last chance to keep Ava." "Hey!" Mason stopped walking, forcing Victoria to stop too. "Listen to me. You didn't destroy anything. You told the truth. You showed the judge who you really are. That's all anyone can do." Victoria looked at him with eyes that were too bright. What if the truth isn't good enough? Mason didn't have an answer for that. Because sometimes the truth wasn't good enough. Sometimes the world was unfair and the wrong people won, and there was nothing you could do but survive it. But he also knew that Victoria needed hope right now, more than honesty. "Then we'll figure out the next step," he said. "Together. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this." Victoria nodded slowly. Then without warning, she stepped forward and hugged him, fierce and desperate and grateful all at once. Mason froze for a second, surprised, then hugged her back. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder. "For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me. That's not how this works." They stood there on the courthouse steps, two people holding each other up, while the city moved around them and a week of uncertainty stretched ahead like an endless road. The week after the custody hearing felt like living in suspension. Every phone call made Victoria jump. Every email notification sent her reaching for her phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Mason watched her unravel in slow motion, working longer hours at Patterson Shipping, sleeping less, eating almost nothing despite his increasingly frustrated attempts to make her sit down for meals. "You're going to make yourself sick," he said on the third day, finding her in Dave's office at 11 at night, surrounded by spreadsheets and inventory reports. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't been fine since we left the courthouse." Victoria didn't look up from her laptop. "I need to finish this vendor analysis. Dave wants it by Friday. It's Wednesday night. You have time. I have time to work." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, but Mason noticed she kept hitting the wrong keys, kept having to backspace and retype. "Working means I'm not thinking about the hearing. Working means I'm not imagining all the ways I could have answered Mills differently. Working means—" Her voice cracked. She stopped typing and pressed her palms against her eyes. "Working means I don't have to face the fact that I might lose my daughter," she whispered. Mason pulled up a chair and sat down beside her. The office was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of trucks idling in the loading bay. Beyond the window, Chicago sprawled dark and infinite under a clouded sky. "You're not going to lose her," Mason said. "You can't know that." "No, but I can believe it." Victoria lowered her hands. Her face was blotchy, mascara smudged under her eyes. "How? How can you believe anything good is going to happen when everything keeps falling apart?" Mason thought about that, about the 3 years since Sarah's death, the countless moments when he'd wanted to give up, when getting out of bed had felt impossible, and the future had looked like nothing but pain stretching endlessly forward. "Because the alternative is giving up," he said finally. "And I've got a kid who needs me not to give up, same as you." Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she saved her work, closed the laptop, and stood. "Take me home." They drove through empty streets, the city quiet in that particular way it only got late at night. Victoria sat in the passenger seat with her forehead pressed against the cold window, watching streetlights blur past. "Mason?" she said quietly. "Yeah? What was she like? Your wife?" The question caught Mason off guard. He talked about Sarah's death plenty of times, had to, when explaining single parenthood to teachers and doctors and concerned neighbors. But nobody ever asked what she'd been like when she was alive. "Loud," he said after a moment, in the best way. She laughed at her own jokes before she even got to the punchline. Sang in the shower off-key and didn't care. Made up ridiculous voices when she read Chloe bedtime stories. He smiled, remembering. She was terrible at cooking but refused to admit it. Kept trying these complicated recipes from websites and then acting surprised when they turned into disasters. I'd come home to the smoke alarm going off and Sarah standing in the kitchen covered in flour, insisting she'd totally meant for the cake to look like that. Victoria's lips curved slightly. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Mason's throat tightened. She was also stubborn as hell and had terrible taste in movies and could hold a grudge for months if you pissed her off. But she was home, you know? Like no matter how bad the day was, coming back to her made it better. "Do you still miss her?" "Every day." Mason's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "But it's different now. At first it was this huge thing that swallowed everything else. Now it's just part of who I am. The guy whose wife died, the single father. It doesn't define me anymore, but it's always there." Victoria nodded slowly, processing this. "Richard and I were never like that. We got married because it made sense. He was climbing the corporate ladder, I was building my company, and being married to each other looked good on paper. Power couple, you know? Everyone said we were perfect together. But you weren't. We were perfect for about 6 months. Then we were just two people living in the same house and pretending we liked each other. When I filed for divorce, he acted devastated in public but relieved in private. The custody thing," she stopped. "I don't even think he wants Ava. Not really. He just wants to win." "Some people are like that." "I know, doesn't make it hurt less." Victoria turned away from the window to look at Mason. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why aren't you angry? At the universe? At whatever took your wife away? I keep waiting for you to be bitter about it, but you're just not." Mason considered this. "I was angry. For months. I was so angry I couldn't see straight. Angry at the ice on the road. Angry at Sarah for dying. Angry at myself for not being there. Angry at everyone who still had their spouse while mine was dead. It was eating me alive. What changed? Chloe did. Mason pulled into his apartment building's parking lot and killed the engine. One morning, maybe 4 months after Sarah died, Chloe woke up crying because she'd had a nightmare. And I went to comfort her, and she looked at me and said, "Daddy, are you going to die too?" And I realized the anger wasn't just hurting me, it was hurting her. She needed a father who could be present, not someone drowning in rage. So I made a choice to let it go. Just like that? Not just like that. It took time, but I decided to try. And eventually, trying became actual healing. Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to get out of the car. I don't know how to let go of what happened to my company. It feels like if I stop being angry, I'm admitting they won. That stealing from me was okay. Being angry and letting go aren't mutually exclusive, Mason said. You can be pissed about what they did and still move forward. The two things can exist at the same time. Is that what you're doing? Moving forward? Mason thought about his life. The apartment that was too small, the job that barely paid enough, the endless cycle of bills and worry, and making do with less. On paper, he hadn't moved anywhere. He was stuck in the same place he'd been 3 years ago. But then he thought about Chloe laughing at breakfast, about Victoria and Ava fitting into their lives like puzzle pieces he hadn't known were missing, about the way his apartment felt less empty now, less like a monument to grief and more like an actual home. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." They went upstairs to find Mrs. Chen dozing on the couch while both girls slept in Chloe's bedroom, tangled together like puppies. Mason paid Mrs. Chen and thanked her. Then he and Victoria stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching their daughters sleep. "She looks peaceful," Victoria whispered, looking at Ava. "They both do. I keep thinking about what happens if I lose the custody case. Where does she go? To Richard's sterile apartment with his new girlfriend who barely tolerates children? To some custody arrangement where I only see her on weekends?" Victoria's voice was barely audible. "How do I survive that?" Mason didn't have an answer, so he just reached out and squeezed her shoulder, and they stood there in the darkness, two parents trying to hold on to hope while the world waited to see if it would be ripped away. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Mason was at work, loading a shipment of automotive parts, when Dave appeared in the warehouse doorway looking uncharacteristically excited. "Reed, get in here!" Mason set down the box he was carrying and jogged over. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Get Victoria. Tell her to come to the office now." "She's already there. Has been since 6. "Of course she has. Woman's a machine." Dave was practically vibrating with energy. "Just get her. This can't wait." Mason found Victoria exactly where he expected, buried in paperwork, coffee cup empty beside her. She looked up when he entered, eyebrows raised. "Dave wants to see you," Mason said. He seemed, I don't know, excited about something. Victoria's expression immediately shifted to worry. "Did I do something wrong?" He said everything's right. Come on. They found Dave in his office, grinning like someone who'd just won the lottery. He gestured for Victoria to sit down, practically bouncing on his heels. "So I was reviewing the reports you've been putting together," Dave said. "The vendor analysis, the efficiency recommendations, all of it." Victoria nodded cautiously. "Yes? You found $12,000 in savings." $12,000, Victoria, in 3 weeks. "You've identified duplicate payments, negotiated better rates with suppliers, streamlined our ordering process. My accountant looked at your work and said it's the best organized our books have been in 15 years. I'm glad the work is satisfactory." "Satisfactory? It's goddamn miraculous." Dave leaned forward. "Here's the thing. I've been thinking about expanding, opening a second warehouse across town, taking on bigger contracts. But I couldn't do it because the operational side of this place was held together with duct tape and hope. Now, looking at what you've done in 3 weeks, I think I actually could." Victoria blinked. That's wonderful, Dave." "It is. Which is why I want to offer you a full-time position. Operations manager, 40 hours a week, full benefits, $50,000 a year to start." The room went silent. Mason watched Victoria's face cycle through disbelief, hope, and fear in rapid succession. "50,000, she repeated slowly. That's lowballing it, honestly. Someone with your skills could get twice that somewhere else. But it's what I can afford right now, and if the expansion works out, we can revisit in 6 months. What do you say? Victoria's hands were shaking. Dave, that's incredibly generous, but I need to be transparent with you. I don't know if you've looked into my background, but there was a scandal with my previous company. Embezzlement charges, media coverage. If you hire me full-time, that might reflect badly on Patterson Shipping. Dave waved this off. I know who you are. Victoria Langford, former CEO of Langford Technologies. I knew the day Mason brought you in. Victoria's eyes widened. You knew? Lady, you were on the cover of Chicago Business Review 2 years ago. You think I don't read the business section? Dave chuckled. I knew exactly who you were, and I also knew that you got screwed by people you trusted, not the other way around. The way I see it, you're either the unluckiest businesswoman in Chicago or you learned a very expensive lesson about vetting employees. Either way, I'm willing to take the chance. Why? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Because in 3 weeks, you've done more for this company than the last 5 people I hired combined. Because you show up early and stay late and give a damn about doing good work. Because Mason vouched for you, and Mason's never steered me wrong. Dave extended his hand. So what do you say? Want to help me build something? Victoria stared at his outstretched hand. Mason could see her mind racing, calculating what this meant. $50,000 a year. Full-time employment. Benefits. Proof of stability for the custody case that was more solid than anything she'd had before. She shook Dave's hand. Yes, thank you. Yes. Dave grinned. Excellent. I'll have HR draw up the paperwork. You can start officially on Monday. Victoria nodded, still looking shell-shocked. Mason steered her out of Dave's office before she could start crying in front of their boss. Did that just happen? Victoria asked once they were alone in the hallway. That just happened. $50,000. Mason, I can afford an apartment. I can buy Ava new clothes that actually fit. I can start paying you real rent instead of the pittance I've been giving you. You don't have to. I want to. Victoria grabbed his hands, her eyes bright. This changes everything. The custody case, the judge seeing I have stable employment and income. This could actually work. We might actually win. Mason had never seen her smile like that, full and genuine and unguarded. It transformed her face, made her look years younger. We should celebrate, he said impulsively. Celebrate? Yeah, dinner somewhere that isn't my apartment. Nothing fancy, just something to mark this. Victoria hesitated. I should probably be saving every penny. 1 meal, Victoria. You're allowed to be happy about good news for 5 minutes. She considered this, then nodded. Okay, 1 meal, but somewhere cheap. I'm buying. They ended up at the same roadside diner where this had all started, sitting in the same booth by the window. Donna recognized them immediately and broke into a huge grin. Well, look who's back, the kind stranger and his friend. She winked at Mason. How's life treating you two? Better, Victoria said, and there was real warmth in her voice. Much better. They ordered burgers and fries, good ones this time, not just what they could afford, and talked about Dave's expansion plans and what Victoria's new role would look like. For the first time since the courthouse, she seemed relaxed, present, like she was allowing herself to believe things might actually work out. Mason, Victoria said, dragging a fry through ketchup, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've been through, I think we're past the point of worrying about personal. Fair point, she smiled. Do you ever think about dating again? Meeting someone new? The question surprised him. Sometimes. Chloe's asked about it a few times. Whether I'll ever get her a new mom. He paused. I tell her maybe someday, but honestly, I don't know. The idea of starting over with someone, of letting them into our life, it feels complicated. Because of Sarah? Because of everything. The grief, the baggage, the kid who comes with trust issues and questions about why her mom died. That's a lot to ask someone to take on. Mason met Victoria's eyes. What about you? You ever think about trying again after Richard? I think about burning all his belongings and leaving them on his doorstep. Does that count? Mason laughed. That's healthy. I'm a very healthy individual. Victoria's smile faded slightly. Honestly, the idea of trusting someone again, really trusting them, it terrifies me.
Richard, my executives, the investors who abandoned me the second things got hard. I'm starting to think I'm terrible at judging character. You trusted me. That was desperation, not judgment. Was it? Mason challenged gently. Or did you recognize that I was offering help without strings attached, and you made the call to accept it? Victoria opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Maybe. I don't know. The lines are blurry. They finished their meal talking about safer topics. Chloe's upcoming school play, Ava's obsession with a book series about dragons, the perpetual battle to get either child to eat vegetables. Normal parent conversation, the kind Mason hadn't realized he'd been missing. When they got back to the apartment, both girls were doing homework at the coffee table, Mrs. Chen supervising with sharp eyes. Your daughter is very smart, Mrs. Chen told Victoria approvingly. Good at math. Like her mother, yes? I hope so, Victoria said. After Mrs. Chen left, the four of them settled into their evening routine, the one that had developed naturally over the past weeks without anyone planning it. Homework, then dinner, then the girls got an hour of TV while Mason and Victoria cleaned up. It felt domestic in a way that should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. Around 9, Mason's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Is this Mason Reed? A woman's voice, professional and clipped. Yeah, who's this? My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an investigator hired by Richard Langford's legal team. I'm calling to verify some information about Victoria Langford's current living situation. Mason's stomach dropped. He caught Victoria's eye across the room and mouthed Richard's lawyer. Her face went pale. What kind of information? Mason asked carefully. We're trying to confirm the nature of your relationship with Miss Langford. How long have you known her? About 3 weeks. And she's living in your apartment. She and her daughter are staying with me temporarily, yes. Can you describe the sleeping arrangements? Mason's jaw tightened. Miss Langford and her daughter share the bedroom. My daughter and I have the living room. Everything is completely appropriate. I see. And what is the financial arrangement? Is Ms. Langford paying rent? That's between me and Victoria. Mr. Reed, I'm simply trying to establish... You're trying to find something to use against her in court, Mason cut in, and I'm not going to help you do that. Victoria is a good mother who's working hard to provide for her daughter. That's all you need to know. Mr. Reed, we're done here. Mason hung up. Victoria was standing now, arms wrapped around herself. They're building a case. They're going to say the living arrangement is inappropriate, that I'm, I don't know, taking advantage of you or exposing Ava to an unstable situation. Let them say it. Anyone with eyes can see this is a stable situation. But the judge doesn't have eyes on us. The judge has whatever Richard's lawyers tell them. Victoria's voice rose with panic. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're going to twist everything good into something suspicious. Before Mason could respond, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Ellen Bradshaw standing in the hallway, briefcase in hand and expression grim. We need to talk, she said. Ellen came inside and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out a folder stuffed with papers. Victoria joined her, moving like someone walking to their own execution. Richard's team filed a motion this afternoon, Ellen said without preamble. They're requesting an emergency review of the custody arrangement, claiming they have new evidence that Ava is in an unsafe environment. What evidence? Victoria demanded. We just got off the phone with one of their investigators. Photos of you leaving the warehouse late at night, of Ava sleeping in the car outside while you worked inside. Ellen pulled out several printed images and spread them across the table. They're claiming you're still essentially homeless, that you're using Mason's address as a front, but actually living out of your vehicle. Victoria grabbed the photos. Mason looked over her shoulder and felt rage building in his chest. The images showed Victoria's Range Rover parked in Patterson Shipping's lot at night, Ava visible through the window, curled up in the back seat. This was one night, Victoria said, her voice shaking. One night when I was working late and Ava fell asleep in the car before I could drive us home. We weren't living there. We were... I know, but intent doesn't matter. Optics do. Ellen's expression was sympathetic but firm. The emergency review is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We have less than 24 hours to prepare a response. Tomorrow? Victoria stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. How is that legal? How can they just... Emergency custody reviews can be fast-tracked if there's evidence of immediate danger to the child. Richard's lawyers are claiming there is. Ellen looked at Mason. I'm going to need you to testify again. We need to establish definitively that Victoria and Ava are living with you full-time, that the photo is misleading. Mason nodded. Whatever you need. Good. Victoria, I also need documentation of your new job offer. Employment contract, pay stubs if you have them, anything showing stable income. I haven't officially started yet. The paperwork won't be ready until Monday. Then we get Dave Patterson to write a letter confirming the offer. Tonight. Ellen was already pulling out her phone. What's his number? The next few hours were chaos. Dave came through with a detailed letter on company letterhead confirming Victoria's full-time position and salary. Mrs. Chen wrote another character reference, this one specifically addressing the night in question. She'd been babysitting and confirmed that Victoria had simply worked late, nothing more sinister. Mason watched Victoria spiral, her earlier joy completely obliterated by this new crisis. She paced the apartment, rehearsing answers to potential questions, her voice getting higher and more frantic with each pass. Hey, he said finally, catching her arm as she paced past. You need to breathe. I can't breathe. They're going to take her. Mason, they're going to use one stupid night against me and look at me. Mason awaited until she met his eyes. We're going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and we're going to tell the truth. That you were working to build a better life for Ava. That you made a judgment call to let her sleep instead of waking her up. That you're a mother doing her best in impossible circumstances. And if the judge can't see that, then the system is broken, not you. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. What if my best isn't good enough? Then we appeal. We keep fighting, but we don't give up before the battle even starts. She nodded, wiping her eyes roughly. Okay, we fight. The emergency review the next morning felt like a trial in miniature. Same courtroom, same judge, but with an urgency that made everything feel sharper. Richard sat with his lawyers looking confident, almost smug. Mills presented the photos like they were evidence of abuse, painting a picture of Victoria as a woman so obsessed with work that she'd rather let her daughter sleep in a car than provide proper care. Ellen countered with Dave's letter, Mrs. Chen's reference, Mason's testimony about the actual living arrangement. She showed bank records proving Victoria had been paying rent, utility bills with both names, school records listing Mason's address as Ava's primary residence. Judge Holloway listened to everything with the same inscrutable expression she'd worn at the first hearing. Then she asked to speak to Ava. The request sent a shock through the courtroom. Victoria went white. Richard leaned over to whisper frantically with Mills. Your Honor, Ellen said carefully. With respect, Ava is 7 years old, subjecting her to questioning. I'm not going to interrogate the child, Ms. Bradshaw. I simply want to ask her a few questions about her current living situation. In chambers, with both parents present if they wish. It wasn't really a request. It was a ruling. 10 minutes later, Mason found himself sitting in Judge Holloway's chambers, wood-paneled walls, law books lining shelves, a desk that looked older than he was. Victoria sat beside him, rigid with fear. Richard and one of his lawyers occupied chairs across the room. Ava came in holding Ellen's hand, looking small and scared. She saw her mother and immediately ran to Victoria, climbing into her lap. Hi, sweetie, Judge Holloway said gently, her stern courtroom demeanor softening. My name is Judge Holloway. Do you know why you're here? Ava nodded against Victoria's shoulder. Can you talk to me about where you've been living? I know this might be confusing, but I just want to understand what's been happening. Ava was quiet for a long moment. Then she lifted her head and said in a small voice, We live with Mr. Mason and Chloe now. And do you like living there? Yes. Chloe's my best friend. We share a room and she lets me have the side by the window. That's nice of her. What about before you lived with Mason and Chloe? Where were you staying? Ava's hand tightened on Victoria's shirt. In Mama's car, but Mama said it was camping. We were camping until we could go home. Did you feel safe when you were camping? Mama always kept me safe. Ava's voice was fierce, protective. She made sure I had food and she told me stories so I wasn't scared of the dark. She said we were having an adventure. Judge Holloway's expression softened further. Your mama sounds like she takes good care of you. She does. She's the best mama.
Ava looked at Richard for the first time, her small face hardening in a way that was startling on a 7-year-old. Daddy wants me to live with him, but I don't want to. I want to stay with Mama and Mr. Mason and Chloe. Ava, Richard started, but Judge Holloway held up a hand. Mr. Langford, please. She turned back to Ava. Can you tell me why you want to stay where you are? Because we're happy there. Mama smiles again. She wasn't smiling when we were in the car, but now she does. And Mr. Mason makes funny voices when he reads stories, and Chloe taught me how to play this game with cards, and Mrs. Chen makes dumplings on Thursdays. Ava's words came faster, tumbling over each other. And Mama has a job now, so we can get our own place soon, but even if we stay with Mr. Mason forever, that would be okay because he's nice and he doesn't yell and he lets Mama rest when she's tired. Judge Holloway was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she said gently, Thank you, Ava. You've been very helpful. You can go back with Ms. Bradshaw now. After Ava left, the judge looked at both parents. I'll have my decision by end of day. You'll be notified via your attorneys. They filed out of chambers in tense silence. In the hallway, Richard tried to approach Victoria, but she turned away sharply. Don't, she said. Just don't. Mason drove Victoria back to the apartment through heavy traffic, neither of them speaking. What was there to say? The decision was out of their hands now, resting with a judge who held all the power. They picked up both girls from school. Mrs. Chen had taken them that morning and brought them home. Ava seemed quieter than usual, subdued after the morning's ordeal. Chloe tried to cheer her up with increasingly ridiculous jokes, which helped a little. At 4:30, Victoria's phone rang. She looked at the screen, went pale, and answered. This is Victoria Langford. Mason watched her face as she listened, watched hope and fear battle across her expression, watched her close her eyes and press her free hand against her mouth. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely steady. Thank you so much. She ended the call and looked at Mason. I won, she whispered. The judge ruled in my favor. I keep full custody. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ava launched herself at Victoria, and Victoria caught her, and both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. Chloe started cheering, and Mason felt something loosen in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally releasing. They'd won. Against all odds, against Richard's expensive lawyers and incriminating photos and the weight of scandal, they'd actually won. That night, after the girls had finally crashed from excitement and exhaustion, Mason and Victoria sat on the apartment's small balcony, barely big enough for 2 lawn chairs, drinking cheap beer and watching the city lights. Ellen said the judge cited Ava's testimony as a deciding factor, Victoria said quietly. Said it was clear that despite the temporary housing crisis, I'd maintained a loving, stable relationship with my daughter. That my quick action in securing employment and housing demonstrated good judgment, not instability. I told you it would work out. You did. I didn't believe you. Victoria turned to look at him. I don't know how to thank you, Mason. You gave me my daughter back. That's not something I can ever repay. I didn't do anything except let you use my couch. You did everything. You saw us when we were invisible. You helped when you had no reason to. You stood up in court for someone you barely knew. Her voice caught. You saved us. Mason shook his head. You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to stand while you did it. They sat in comfortable silence, and Mason thought about how strange life was. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a single father going through the motions, working and surviving, but not really living. Now his apartment was full of noise and life, and people who felt like family even though they weren't. What happens now? He asked. Victoria took a long drink of her beer. Now I work. I save money. I find an apartment that Ava and I can afford. I rebuild my life piece by piece. And the company? Langford Technologies? I don't know. The criminal trial against Marcus and the others is still pending. If we win, I might get some of the money back. But even then, I don't know if I want to go back to that life. Being a CEO, dealing with boards and investors and people who only care about quarterly returns. She smiled slightly. Turns out I like working at a warehouse more than I expected. Dave's talking about teaching me to drive the forklifts. Mason laughed. You? On a forklift? I contain multitudes. Victoria's smile faded. But seriously, I think I need something different this time.
Something smaller, more manageable. Something where I'm not trying to build an empire, just a good business that helps people. That sounds healthy. It sounds terrifying, but also right. They finished their beers as the temperature dropped and the city hummed its endless song below them. Tomorrow, Victoria would start her first official day as operations manager. She'd begin the search for an apartment, start rebuilding the life that had been stripped away. The hard work of recovery was just beginning, but tonight, they'd won. And that was enough. 3 months after the custody hearing, Mason stood in the loading bay of Patterson Shipping, watching Victoria negotiate with a supplier over the phone. She was using what he'd come to think of as her CEO voice, calm, professional, absolutely unshakable. And the poor guy on the other end didn't stand a chance. "I understand that's your standard rate," Victoria said, examining a clipboard with one hand while holding her phone with the other. "But we both know you're charging Midwest Logistics 15% less for the same service. So either we get comparable pricing or we take our business to your competitor who's already offered us a better deal." She paused, listening. Mason could hear the tinny sound of the supplier's voice rising in pitch. "Excellent. I'll expect the revised contract by end of day Monday. Thank you for your flexibility." Victoria hung up and made a note on the clipboard. "That's another $800 a month in savings." "You're terrifying," Mason said admiringly. "I prefer effective." Victoria smiled. "But I'll take terrifying." She looked different these days. Still wore the thrift store blazer. It had become something of a lucky charm, but now paired with clothes that actually fit. Hair professionally cut. An expression that had lost most of its haunted quality. She'd put on weight, filled out the hollow spaces that hunger and stress had carved into her face. She looked healthy. She looked happy. She looked like someone who'd survived hell and come out stronger on the other side. "Dave wants to see us both in his office," Victoria said, tucking the clipboard under her arm. "Something about the expansion plans." They found Dave hunched over architectural drawings, scratching his head. "These contractors are trying to rob me blind. 20% markup on labor costs? Do they think I'm stupid?" "Probably," Victoria said cheerfully. "Let me see." She spent the next 15 minutes dismantling the contractor's proposal with surgical precision, pointing out inflated costs and unnecessary expenses. Dave watched with the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe his luck in hiring her. "You should have been doing this all along," he said when she finished. "Forget operations manager. You should be running your own consulting firm." Victoria paused, something flickering across her face. "Funny you should mention that." Mason looked at her sharply. "Victoria? I was going to wait to tell you both, but..." She took a breath. "I've been thinking about starting something new. Small scale, nothing like Langford Technologies. Just me helping businesses like Patterson Shipping optimize their operations. I'd keep working here part-time, Dave, if you'll have me, but I think I'm ready to try building something again." Dave grinned. "About damn time. You're wasted just working for me, though I'm keeping you on retainer whether you like it or not." "Deal." Victoria turned to Mason. "What do you think?" Mason thought about the woman he'd met in the diner 4 months ago, broken, desperate, convinced she'd lost everything that mattered. And now here she was, ready to take another risk, ready to build something new from the ashes of what had burned down. "I think it's perfect," he said. That evening, Mason came home to find his apartment in chaos. Chloe and Ava had constructed what appeared to be a blanket fort spanning the entire living room, using every pillow and sheet in the apartment. The structure was architecturally questionable but impressive in scope. "We made a castle," Chloe announced proudly, "and you can't come in unless you know the password." "Which is?" "We haven't decided yet. Give us a minute." The girls retreated into their fort for a whispered conference. Mason caught Victoria's eye across the room. She was curled up on the couch with her laptop, working on what he assumed was a business plan for her new venture. "How's it going?" he asked. "Slowly. I forgot how hard it is to start from scratch." Victoria closed the laptop and stretched. "But good hard, the kind of work that feels like it matters." "You found an office yet?" "I'm looking at a space downtown next week. It's tiny, barely bigger than a closet, but it's cheap and it's mine." She smiled. "Well, it will be mine if the landlord accepts my application." Over the past months, Victoria had been saving aggressively, putting away every penny she could toward first and last month's rent on an apartment. She'd found a place 2 miles from Mason's building, small but decent,
in a neighborhood with good schools. She and Ava would be moving out in 3 weeks. The knowledge sat heavy in Mason's chest, even though he knew it was the right thing. Victoria needed her independence. She needed to prove to herself and to any judge who might question her in the future that she could stand on her own, but the apartment was going to feel empty without them. "The password is Unicorn Pizza," Ava announced, poking her head out of the fort. "That's a terrible password," Mason said. "That's what makes it good. Nobody would ever guess it." Mason dutifully said Unicorn Pizza and was granted entrance to the fort, which turned out to be surprisingly spacious inside. Chloe had rigged up a flashlight for mood lighting, and they'd stocked it with snacks stolen from the kitchen. "We're having a meeting of the Secret Castle Club," Chloe informed him seriously. "Members only, but you can stay if you promise not to tell any adults." "What am I?" "You're a dad. That doesn't count as an adult. Adults are like teachers and principals, and people who make you eat vegetables." Mason accepted this logic and settled into the fort. The girls immediately began planning some elaborate game involving dragons and treasure, and a princess who saved herself without waiting for a prince. Mason half listened, content to just be present in this small, protected space they'd created. His phone buzzed. Text from Dave. "Need you to check the loading dock schedule for tomorrow. Got a last-minute shipment coming in." Mason extracted himself from the fort, promising to return with intelligence about dinner plans. He found Victoria in the kitchen, starting to assemble something that looked like stir-fry. "Dave needs me to check on something at the warehouse," Mason said. "I'll be back in an hour. You okay handling dinner?" "I think I can manage to not burn down your kitchen." Victoria paused. "Actually, no promises, but I'll try." Mason grabbed his keys and headed out. The warehouse was only 10 minutes away, quiet and dark except for the security lights. He let himself in through the side entrance and made his way to the office. The schedule was where Dave said it would be, but there was also a note attached. "Read, been thinking about your situation with the forklift certification. Company will pay for the training if you're interested. Let me know." Mason stared at the note. Forklift certification meant better pay, more responsibilities, a step up from general loading work. He'd mentioned it to Dave months ago, back when money had been even tighter than usual. But then everything with Victoria had happened, and he'd forgotten about it. Now Dave was offering to pay for it. Mason folded the note and tucked it in his pocket. Something to think about. On his way out, he passed the office that had become Victoria's domain. The light was off, but he could see through the window that she'd organized everything with ruthless efficiency. Color-coded files, labeled drawers, a system that actually made sense. The chaos Dave had lived with for 20 years had been transformed into something clean and functional. Mason thought about what Victoria had said earlier, about starting her own consulting business, about building something new. She was going to be fine, better than fine. She was going to thrive. The realization made him happy and sad in equal measure. When he got back to the apartment, dinner was ready. Stir-fry that was slightly overcooked but edible. They ate together at the coffee table, the fort looming over them like a fabric cathedral. "I got into a fight at school today," Ava said casually, spearing a piece of broccoli. Victoria's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "You what?" "Not a real fight, just words. Tommy Harrison said my mom was a loser who couldn't keep a job, so I told him my mom was smarter than his whole family combined, and also he smells like cheese." "Ava," Victoria started, "he does smell like cheese, Mama. Everyone knows it." Mason bit his lip to keep from laughing. Chloe wasn't as successful and snorted milk through her nose, which set off both girls giggling. "We don't call people losers," Victoria said, trying to maintain parental authority while clearly fighting a smile. "Even when they're wrong about things. What did your teacher say?" "She said Tommy shouldn't spread rumors and I shouldn't comment on people's smell. Then she made us apologize to each other." Ava shrugged. "But I wasn't really sorry. He was mean about you." Victoria's expression softened. "I appreciate you defending me, baby, but you don't have to fight my battles." "But you'd fight mine." "That's different. I'm the mom." "So? I can't fight for you because I'm the kid? That's not fair." Mason watched this exchange with fascination. Ava had grown bolder over the past months, more willing to speak up and push back. The scared little girl who'd stared at Chloe's fries in the diner had been replaced by someone confident and fierce. Victoria had done that. Despite everything, the homelessness, The custody battle, the constant stress. She'd raised a daughter who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend the people she loved. How about this? Victoria said. You can fight for me with words, not fists, and try to avoid comments about how people smell. Even when it's true? Especially when it's true. After dinner, Mason did dishes while Victoria helped both girls with homework. Through the kitchen window, he could see the Chicago skyline lit up against the dark sky. 4 months ago, he'd looked at that same view and seen nothing but the endless repetition of his life. Work, home, Chloe, repeat. Not bad exactly, but empty of anything that felt like forward momentum. Now everything was different. His apartment was full of life and noise and people who needed him. He had a job opportunity that could mean better pay. He had friends, real friends, not just acquaintances who said hi in passing. He had a family, even if it wasn't the traditional kind. Mason? Victoria appeared at his elbow. Can we talk? They stepped out onto the balcony, their usual spot for serious conversations. The night air was cool, Chicago shifting from late summer into early fall. What's up? Mason asked. Victoria leaned against the railing, looking out at the city. I got the apartment. The landlord approved my application. I can move in 2 weeks from Saturday. That's great. Mason meant it, but the words felt hollow. It is. It's everything I've been working toward. Independence, stability, a place that's actually mine. Victoria turned to face him. So why does it feel like I'm making a mistake? Mason's heart did something complicated in his chest. What do you mean? I mean... Victoria stopped, gathering her thoughts. These past 4 months, living here with you and Chloe, it's been the happiest I've been in years. Maybe ever. And I keep telling myself that's just because you saved me when I was at my lowest, that I'm confusing gratitude with something else. But what if it's not confusion? What if this, all of this, is exactly where I'm supposed to be? Mason didn't know what to say. He'd been carefully not thinking about what Victoria's departure would mean, not examining too closely why the thought of her leaving made his chest ache. You deserve your own space, he said finally. You've worked hard for it. I know, but I also deserve to be happy. And I'm happy here. Victoria's voice dropped. Are you happy? The question hung between them in the dark. Mason thought about it honestly. About coming home to a full apartment instead of an empty one. About Victoria's laugh echoing through rooms that used to feel silent. About Chloe having a friend who felt like a sister. About the way he and Victoria had fallen into an easy partnership, cooking together, parenting together, navigating life's daily chaos together. Yeah, he said quietly, I'm happy. Then why are we pretending this is temporary? Mason looked at her, really looked at her, saw the hope and fear warring in her expression, saw someone who'd been burned before and was still brave enough to reach for what she wanted. Because you just got your life back, he said. You won custody, started a business, got back on your feet. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. I don't want you to stay out of obligation. Is that what you think this is? Obligation? Victoria moved closer. Mason, you gave me a place to sleep when I had nothing. But you also gave me something to believe in again. You showed me that not everyone wants something in return, that kindness can exist without strings attached. You made me remember what it feels like to be part of something bigger than just survival. She paused, taking a breath. So no, this is an obligation. This is me choosing to stay because I want to. Because you and Chloe feel like family. Because leaving this apartment to go live somewhere alone sounds like the loneliest thing I can imagine. Mason's throat was tight. Victoria, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that if you wanted, if you were open to the idea, I'd like to stay. Not as a temporary guest, as someone who's actually building a life here. With you. Mason thought about Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried for 3 years, the feeling that moving forward meant betraying her memory. But Sarah had never wanted him to be alone. She'd made him promise, in those last coherent moments before she'd left for the drive she wouldn't return from, that he'd take care of Chloe and take care of himself. You're allowed to be happy, she'd said, kissing him goodbye. Promise me you'll remember that. He'd promised, and then he'd spent 3 years forgetting. I want you to stay, Mason said, the words coming easier than he expected. Not as a guest, as part of this, whatever this is. Victoria's smile was bright enough to light up the whole city. Yeah? Yeah. She hugged him then, fierce and grateful and full of relief. Mason held her and thought about how strange life was, how sometimes the worst moments led to the best ones, how losing everything could teach you what actually mattered. "We should probably tell the girls," Victoria said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "They're going to lose their minds. Chloe's going to demand bunk beds. Ava's going to want to redecorate the entire apartment. We're in so much trouble." Mason laughed. "Worth it." They went inside to find both girls had fallen asleep in the blanket fort, tangled together in a pile of pillows. Mason and Victoria stood in the doorway, watching them sleep. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, "for seeing us when we were invisible. Thank you for trusting me enough to stay visible." 2 months later, Mason stood in the parking lot of an abandoned building on Chicago's south side and tried to see what Victoria saw. "It's a dump," he said honestly. "It's a diamond in the rough," Victoria countered, consulting the notes on her phone. "The structure is solid, the location is good, close to public transit, parking, main roads, and the owner's motivated to sell, which means we can negotiate." "Victoria, we're not buying a building. We barely have savings." "You don't, I do." Victoria turned to face him, eyes bright with the same intensity she'd had when reorganizing Dave's filing system. "Mason, listen. The criminal trial against Marcus and the others finally settled. I'm getting back $4.2 million. Mason's jaw dropped. $4 million. .2. Don't forget the .2. Victoria was practically vibrating with energy. "It's not everything they stole, but it's enough. Enough to buy this building, renovate it, turn it into something that actually helps people." "Turn it into what?" "A community center, with a commercial kitchen, office space for small businesses, meeting rooms. On the ground floor, we open a diner. A real one, not fancy, just good food at prices people can actually afford. Upstairs, we lease office space to people like me who are starting over and need somewhere affordable to work. We hire people who've been down on their luck, give them a chance when nobody else will." Mason stared at her. "You want to build the place that didn't exist when you needed it." Exactly. Victoria grabbed his hands. "I know it's ambitious, I know it's risky, but I also know that if someone had given me a chance 4 months ago, a real chance, not just charity, everything would have been different. I want to be that chance for other people. Why include me in this? It's your money. Because I trust you, because you understand what it means to need help and to give it, because—" Victoria squeezed his hands. "Because we're partners now. In everything." Mason looked at the building again, trying to see past the graffiti and broken windows, trying to imagine it transformed into the vision Victoria described. "Dave's going to kill me if I quit the warehouse," he said. "Who said anything about quitting? I already talked to him. He's willing to invest in the diner as a silent partner if you stay on half-time at Patterson. Says he needs someone to keep me from optimizing his entire life." "You talked to Dave before talking to me?" "I wanted to make sure it was possible before I got your hopes up." Victoria's smile was almost shy. "So? Are you in?" Mason thought about spending the rest of his life loading trucks. It was honest work, good work, nothing to be ashamed of, but it wasn't building something. It wasn't creating change. "I'm in," he said, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "We hired Donna from the roadside diner. She deserves better than that place." Victoria's eyes got bright. "Deal." The renovation took 6 months and every penny of patience Mason possessed. There were permit issues, contractor delays, a memorable week when they discovered asbestos that required complete abatement. Victoria handled most of it with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to everything, but even she had moments of doubt. "What if this doesn't work?" she asked one night, surrounded by paint samples and budget spreadsheets. "What if we sink all this money into a community center nobody needs?" "Then we'll have built something anyway," Mason said. "That counts for something." Chloe and Ava were deeply invested in the project, offering increasingly creative suggestions for the diner's design. Chloe wanted a wall painted like a forest. Ava insisted they needed a dessert menu with at least 12 kinds of pie. Both girls agreed that the booths should be arranged so kids could see out the windows. In the end, the space was beautiful in a way that felt earned rather than bought. Exposed brick walls, salvaged wood tables, windows that let in light without being pretentious about it. The kind of place that said, "You're welcome here," without making you feel like you needed to dress up or watch your language. The diner opened on a cold Saturday in March, almost exactly 1 year after Mason had first seen Victoria standing in Miller's roadside diner. Donna was head chef, managing a kitchen she'd personally designed for maximum efficiency. They'd hired 4 other staff members, all people who'd been passed over elsewhere for various reasons, and were grateful for the chance. The first day was chaos. They ran out of coffee by noon, the register system crashed twice, and one of the new waiters spilled an entire tray of burgers on a customer. But people came. They filled the booths, ordered food, left tips, came back the next day and brought friends. By the end of the first month, they were breaking even. By the end of the second, they were turning a profit. The office spaces upstairs filled quickly. Small businesses, solo consultants, a woman starting a nonprofit to help domestic violence survivors. Victoria kept the rents low and offered business consulting to any tenant who wanted it. She called it the Rebuild Program, and it became the building's heart. Mason managed the day-to-day operations, working mornings at Patterson Shipping and afternoons at the center. It was exhausting and exhilarating and felt more like purpose than anything he'd done since Sarah died. One evening, about 3 months after the opening, Mason was closing up the diner when Victoria appeared with 2 beers and a folder. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the folder. "Financial reports. We're officially in the black. The diner's profitable, the office rentals are covering their costs, and we've got a waiting list for the Rebuild Program." Victoria handed him a beer. "We did it!" Mason clinked his bottle against hers. "You did it. I just helped." "We did it together. Stop being modest. It's annoying." They sat in one of the booths, the same one where Chloe had insisted they needed to be able to see the sky, and watched the Chicago evening settle in outside the windows. "You know what's weird?" Victoria said. "A year ago, I would have said my company was everything, that without Langford Technologies, I was nothing. But now," she gestured around the diner, "this feels bigger than that ever did, more real. Because it is real. You're not building an empire. You're building something that actually helps people." "We're building something that helps people," Victoria corrected. "You're just as responsible for this as I am." Mason thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a rainy night and a hungry child to this warm space filled with purpose and possibility. He thought about how close they'd both come to giving up, to accepting that their lives were just about survival and nothing more. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Always. When Sarah died, I thought that was it. The good part of my life was over, and everything after would just be getting through the days until I didn't have to anymore. I wasn't suicidal or anything, just resigned." Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. "But then you and Ava showed up," Mason continued, "and suddenly everything changed. Not all at once, not like some fairy tale, but gradually, day by day, my life started feeling like it was worth living again instead of just enduring. So thank you for letting me help you, for staying, for building this with me." "Thank you for seeing us," Victoria said softly, "for recognizing that we were worth saving." They sat there as the light faded outside and the diner settled into evening quiet. Somewhere upstairs, someone was working late in one of the offices. Down the street, people were heading home from work, living their lives, making their own journeys through whatever darkness they were navigating. And here, in this space they'd built from broken pieces and second chances, 2 people who'd lost everything had found something worth keeping. 6 months after the diner opened, Mason and Victoria stood in front of a small crowd gathered for the community center's official dedication ceremony. Chloe and Ava sat in the front row, dressed up and squirming with excitement. Dave was there, looking proud. Mrs. Chen had brought dumplings. Even Ellen Bradshaw had shown up, smiling approvingly at how far her client had come. Victoria gave a speech about second chances and the power of community. Mason added a few words about how sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, if you're brave enough to keep moving forward. It was simple and honest and a little rough around the edges, which felt appropriate. Afterward, while everyone ate and talked and celebrated, Mason found himself standing by the window watching the scene. This place they'd built, it wasn't perfect. The heating system was temperamental, the floors creaked, there were a dozen small problems that needed fixing. But it was alive. It was helping people. And it existed because 2 strangers had decided to take a chance on each other when they had nothing left to lose. Chloe appeared at his elbow. She was 10 now, taller than she'd been that rainy night in the diner, more confident, Still made terrible jokes and refused to eat vegetables, but growing up anyway. Dad? She said. Yeah, baby? Are you happy? Mason looked around the room. At Victoria laughing with Donna about some kitchen disaster. At Ava showing Mrs. Chen a drawing she'd made of the building. At all the people who'd found their way here, looking for a second chance and finding community instead. Yeah, he said, putting his arm around his daughter. I'm really happy. Good. Me too. Chloe leaned into his side. Do you think Mom would have liked this place? The question caught Mason off guard. Chloe didn't talk about Sarah much anymore, not because she'd forgotten, but because the grief had softened into something gentler, memories instead of wounds. I think she would have loved it, Mason said honestly. She always wanted to do something that mattered. I think she'd be proud of us. Of you and Victoria? Of all of us. Chloe nodded, satisfied. Then, are you and Victoria going to get married? Mason nearly choked on his drink. What? You know, married, like how parents are supposed to be married. Chloe said it casually, like she was asking about what was for dinner. Ava and I were talking about it. We think you should. It's complicated, Chloe. Why is it complicated? You love her, she loves you. We all live together anyway. Marriage just makes it official. Chloe looked at him with Sarah's eyes, too knowing for 10 years old. Mom wouldn't want you to be alone forever. She told me that once, before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, you should find someone who makes you happy again. Mason's throat was tight. She said that to you? Yeah, I was little, so I didn't really understand, but I understand now. Chloe hugged him. It's okay to be happy, Dad. You're allowed. She skipped off to find Ava, leaving Mason standing there with his heart cracked open. He looked across the room and found Victoria watching him, a question in her eyes. He smiled and nodded, and she smiled back. They'd get there. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. They had time. They had each other. They had this place they'd built and the community growing around it, and 2 daughters who deserved to see that even when everything falls apart, you can build something new from the pieces. That night, after everyone left and the building was quiet, Mason and Victoria did a final walkthrough, checking that doors were locked, lights were off, everything was secure for the night. I've been thinking, Victoria said as they walked through the empty diner, about expansion. We just opened 6 months ago. I know, but there are other neighborhoods that need places like this. Other people who need second chances. Victoria's eyes were already distant, seeing possibilities. What if this was just the start? What if we could build a whole network of community centers, each one tailored to its neighborhood, each one giving people a place to rebuild? Mason laughed. You can't stop, can you? Always have to be building something bigger. That's not true. I can stop. Victoria paused. I just don't want to. Not when we're actually making a difference. Okay, but can we master one location before we start planning world domination? Fair point. Victoria slipped her hand into his. One step at a time. They walked out into the Chicago night, locking the door behind them. The city stretched out around them, full of people carrying their own struggles, fighting their own battles, searching for their own second chances. Mason thought about the path that had brought them here. From that rainy night to this moment, from strangers to partners to something that didn't have a simple name but felt like home anyway. It hadn't been smooth. There had been setbacks and struggles and moments when giving up seemed easier than pushing forward. But they'd kept going, together. And that, Mason thought, as they walked toward the car, hands linked in the